Imagine for a moment standing on the white cliffs of Dover, looking out across the shimmering English Channel. Now, imagine that water isn't there. Instead of chalky cliffs dropping to the sea, the land simply continues. A vast, rolling plain of marsh and forest, teeming with herds of giant deer and wild boar, stretches all the way to what we now call France. You could, if you had the time and a sturdy pair of boots, simply walk to Paris. This isn't a fantasy landscape. It was the reality of our world for thousands of years. Britain wasn't an island at all. It was the forgotten, wild northwest corner of Europe. The story of how it became the island we know today, and the story of the people who lived through that colossal transformation, is one of the most profound and mysterious in human history. It's a tale written not in books, but in flint scatters on lonely moors, in ancient DNA locked within a caveman's tooth, and in the haunting landscapes drowned beneath the cold grey waves of the North Sea. This is the story of Mesolithic Britain, a period we will explore together, slowly and peacefully, as you prepare for rest. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As we settle in, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. Just drop a comment below and let's see how far our little historical journey reaches. Our story does not begin with people or even with animals. It begins with an ending, the ending of an age of ice that had held the world in its grip for 100,000 years. Picture the land we call Britain, but see it through the lens of deep time, around 20,000 years ago. It is an alien and hostile place, almost entirely buried beneath a colossal sheet of ice known as the Davensian glaciation. This isn't the picturesque, sparkling ice of a winter postcard. This is a monolithic force of nature, a glacier in some places over a mile thick, so heavy that its weight presses down on the very crust of the earth, warping the rock beneath it. To the north, all of Scotland, most of Wales, and the north of England are completely entombed. The sheer pressure and grinding movement of this ice scours the landscape, carving out the valleys and sculpting the mountains we see today. The sound would have been deafening, a constant symphony of cracking, groaning, and the thunderous roar of icefalls. South of this immense frozen wall lies a landscape that is technically ice-free, but no more hospitable. It is a polar desert, a vast expanse of frozen tundra, where the ground is locked in permafrost. Bitter, relentless winds sweep across it, carrying dust and grit, and for most of the year, the temperature would rarely climb above freezing. There are no trees, no soil to speak of, only sparse lichens and hardy mosses clinging to the frozen earth. It is a world of white, grey, and brown, utterly devoid of the lush green we associate with the British Isles. There is no life here, not of the humankind anyway. The last of the Paleolithic hunters, the people of the Old Stone Age, had been forced out millennia before, retreating south into the warmer climes of mainland Europe. Britain, for all intents and purposes, was a lifeless appendage of a frozen continent. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a change began. The Earth, in its long, slow wobble of an orbit around the Sun, tilted just so. The great climatic engine of the planet shifted gear. The brutal cold began to lose its edge. For centuries, the change would have been negligible. A slightly less savage winter here, a slightly longer summer there. But over thousands of years, the effect was monumental. The great thaw had begun. The southern edge of the ice sheet, the colossal wall that stretched across the land, began to weep. Trickles became streams, streams became torrents, and torrents became immense rivers of meltwater, carrying billions of tons of gravel, silt, and rock southwards. The east was not melting peacefully. It was in a chaotic and violent retreat. Huge sections would break away with a sound that would shake the very ground, forming vast temporary lakes of frigid, milky water. The landscape that was slowly being unveiled was a wreck. It was a scarred, raw, and waterlogged world of stone and mud, devoid of life. Think of it like a construction site after the bulldozers have left. A blank canvas of geological debris. As the ice pulled back, the sea levels, which had been hundreds of feet lower than they are today, began their slow and inevitable rise. The water that had been locked away in the planet's ice caps for millennia was now returning to the oceans. But for now, Britain was still firmly anchored to Europe. The North Sea basin was a wide, low-lying plain, and the English Channel was a massive river valley, draining the meltwater from the retreating ice. This newly exposed land, cold and barren as it was, represented an opportunity. The first colonizers were not human. They were the toughest of plants, hardy pioneer grasses, sedges, and dwarf willows and birches, their seeds carried on the wind or in the meltwater. They began to put down roots in the thin gravelly soils, starting the long, slow process of healing the wounded land. And where the plants went, the animals followed. First came the grazers, adapted to the cold, herds of reindeer and wild horse, picking their way through the new subarctic grasslands. They were the advance guard, the first signs of vibrant life returning to the desolate north. Following them, inevitably, were the predators, and following all of them, treading carefully into this new, empty, and promising world, were the first human beings to set foot in what would one day become Britain for over 10,000 years. The mystery that historians and archaeologists still puzzle over is the exact nature of this recolonization. Was it a steady, confident march northwards as the climate improved? Or was it a more hesitant process, with small, exploratory groups pushing into the new territory, only to be forced back by sudden, sharp returns to freezing conditions, like the dramatic cold snap known as the Younger Dryas? The evidence is sparse, just a few scattered flint tools from this earliest period, leaving us to wonder about the courage and desperation of those first pioneers, stepping out onto a truly new world. That new world, that blank canvas of geological debris being slowly painted green with life, had a name. We call it Doggerland. It's a wonderfully mundane name, taken from the Doggerbank, a shallow sandbank in the North Sea long known to Dutch fishermen. But the reality it represents is anything but mundane. Doggerland was Britain's umbilical cord to Europe, a vast, low-lying plain that today is completely submerged. It was not a narrow, precarious land bridge, but a country in its own right. At its peak, it was a territory stretching from the east coast of England to the modern-day Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark, a Mesolithic heartland now lost to the waves. To understand the story of Mesolithic Britain, we must first walk through this drowned world, for it was the grand entrance hall, the primary stage upon which the first acts of this human drama were played out. Forget the English Channel. For these people, it was simply a great river system. Forget the North Sea. It was a sprawling landscape of gentle hills, winding river valleys, and immense marshlands. Imagine standing in the center of this lost continent around 9000 BC. The air is cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth, pine, and the distant salt of a far-off sea. The sky above is enormous, the horizons wide and unbroken by the kind of mountains we see in Scotland or Wales. The land rolls away in subtle undulations, covered not yet by the dense oak forests that will come later, but by a more open woodland of birch and pine, with vast thickets of hazel. This is a landscape absolutely dominated by water. Slow meandering rivers, fat with the last of the glacial meltwater, snake across the plain. They swell into vast, shallow lakes and lagoons fringed with reeds, their surfaces like dark mirrors reflecting the sky. These waterways were the arteries of Doggerland, teeming with fish like pike, perch, and eel, and attracting a breathtaking abundance of bird life. Great flocks of swans, ducks, and cranes would have filled the air with their calls, their migrations marking the turning of the seasons. This was a hunter's paradise. Herds of red deer, elk, and the formidable aurochs wild cattle, the size of small elephants with immense curving horns, moved through the woodlands. Wild boar rooted in the undergrowth, and the rivers were home to beavers and otters. It was a rich, vibrant, and dynamic environment, a world away from the barren tundra that had preceded it. This was the highway into Britain. For generations, small mobile family groups of hunter-gatherers would have moved through this landscape. They weren't consciously migrating to Britain. The concept wouldn't have existed. They were simply following the resources, following the herds of animals as they expanded their territories northward and westward into the newly available land. They would have traveled light, carrying everything they owned on their backs. Their lives were intimately tied to the rhythms of Doggerland seasons. They knew the best places to ford the rivers, the most reliable spots to find flint for their tools, the hidden valleys where the deer would shelter in winter. They built temporary camps on the higher ground, perhaps on the gentle hills overlooking the river valleys, places that offered a good view of approaching game and a breeze to keep the biting insects at bay. Here, they would set up small tents or huts made from animal hides stretched over a frame of wooden poles. The smoke from their hearths, a thin grey smudge against the vast open sky. They were not just passing through this world. They were a part of it, their lives woven into its very fabric. The incredible fact is that we only know this world exists because of fishermen. For over a century, trawlers working in the North Sea have been dredging up clues from the seabed. Their nets, designed to catch cod and plaice, would occasionally bring up something far older. The tusk of a mammoth, the giant antler of an Irish elk, or even beautifully worked flint and bone tools that could only have been made by human hands. These were dismissed as curiosities for a long time, but as the finds mounted, a picture began to emerge of the world that lay beneath the waves. Modern technology has allowed us to map this hidden landscape in stunning detail, using seismic survey data from oil and gas exploration. Archaeologists have been able to peel back the water and sediment and see Doggerland for the first time in 8,000 years. They have traced the courses of its lost rivers, located the shorelines of its ancient lakes, and identified promising locations for human settlement. This leads us to one of the great open mysteries of this period. We know Doggerland was the route into Britain, But was it just a corridor, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else? Or was it a destination in its own right, a Mesolithic heartland with a population and a culture all its own, distinct from those on the higher ground to the east and west? Some archaeologists theorize that Doggerland, with its rich wetlands and coastal resources, may have been one of the most resource-abundant places in Mesolithic Europe, supporting a relatively dense population. Perhaps the few scattered finds we have from the British mainland are just the impoverished outliers, the lonely hunting camps of a people whose true home was out on this fertile plain. It's a tantalizing and haunting thought that the richest archaeological treasures of Britain's first people, their main settlements, their sacred sites, their burial grounds, may lie meters down, buried in the cold, dark silt of the North Sea floor, a British Atlantis waiting to be discovered. From the grand sweeping vista of Doggerland, let us now zoom in. Let's push through the damp fronds of a fern and settle our view on a pair of hands, resting on a moss-covered log near the bank of a slow-moving river. These hands are calloused, stained with earth and berry juice, but they are also incredibly skilled. They are about to perform an act that is part science, part art, and pure survival. For the people moving through this new world, this vast and empty larder did not do so with brute force alone. They did so with an intellect and a technology so refined, so perfectly suited to their environment, that it was, in its own way, as revolutionary as the microchip would be 10,000 years later. Their success rested on their toolkit, a collection of objects so small and unassuming that you could hold a hunter's entire arsenal in the palm of your hand. This was the age of the microlith, the tiny stone components that gave the Mesolithic, or Middle Stone Age, its name. The raw material for this revolution was flint, a strange and wonderful stone, born in the deep time of the Cretaceous seas from the silica-rich skeletons of microscopic sea creatures. For these ancient people, it was the ultimate natural resource, the prehistoric equivalent of high-grade steel. They knew its properties intimately. They would search for it in the gravel beds of rivers, or dig for it in the chalky hills where it formed as nodules, lumpy and grey on the outside, but promising a heart of pure, classy black or grey within. To hold a fresh nodule is to feel its cool, dense weight. To strike it correctly is to understand its magic. Flint doesn't crumble. It fractures in a predictable, shell-like pattern called a conchoidal fracture, the same way a pane of glass breaks, and the edge created by this break is phenomenally sharp, down to a molecular level, far sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. This was the material that would build their world. The process began with a percussionist's touch. The flint napper would select a good hammerstone, a hard quartzite pebble that fit comfortably in their hand. The first few strikes were to test the quality of the flint and to knock off the rough outer rind, the cortex. Then, with controlled and precise blows, they would begin shaping the flint nodule into a prepared core. The goal was no longer to create a single, large tool like the hand axes of their Paleolithic ancestors. The new technology was all about mass production of standardized parts. The prepared core was a source of potential, a carefully shaped stone from which long, thin, parallel-sided flakes, known as blades, could be struck off, one after another, like leaves from an artichoke. A skilled napper, using a softer hammer made of antler or a heavy piece of bone, could produce dozens of these pristine blades from a single core. The sound would have been a sharp, rhythmic tick, 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 echoing through the quiet woodland, a sound of creation and ingenuity. But these blades were just the intermediate step. They were the blank canvases. The true artistry came in, turning them into microliths. A blade would be carefully laid on a small anvil stone, and using a technique called the microburin notch, it would be snapped into smaller segments. Then the most delicate work began: pressure flaking. Instead of striking the flint, the napper would take the pointed tip of an antler and use it to press against the edge of the tiny flint segment. With a carefully applied force, a tiny paper-thin flake would pop off. Slowly, meticulously, they would shape the microlith. They might blunt one side, backing it like the spine of a modern knife blade, so it could be safely set into a handle. They would shape others into viciously sharp points, or into chisel-like tips. The result was a collection of tiny geometric flint components, most no bigger than a fingernail. Why go to all this trouble? The answer is efficiency and modularity. This was a toolkit for people on the move. A single flint core was portable and could be used to create dozens, if not hundreds, of replaceable tool parts. It was the ultimate flat-pack survival kit. These tiny stone pieces were not used by themselves. They were the disposable, interchangeable parts of more complex composite tools. Imagine an arrow. The shaft is a straight piece of hazelwood, carefully scraped smooth. The fletching at the back is made from goose feathers, split and glued in place with a resin made from boiling birch bark, a sticky, waterproof, all-purpose superglue. And at the tip, nestled in a notch, sits a single, perfectly symmetrical, triangular microlithian arrowhead. It is bound tight with thread made from animal sinew and secured with that same black birch bark tar. This weapon is lightweight, accurate, and deadly. And if the point breaks off after hitting a deer, it's no disaster. The hunter simply discards the broken piece, warms the tar on the arrow shaft, and sets a new, identical point in its place. The same principle applied to all their tools. A harpoon for spearing salmon would have a head carved from bone or antler, with a series of grooves cut along its sides. Into these grooves, a row of sharp, crescent-shaped microliths would be set, forming a series of vicious barbs that would hold the struggling fish fast. This brings us to a fascinating archaeological mystery. While we are fairly certain about the function of points as arrowheads, we have found many microliths in strange, highly standardized geometric shapes, perfect little triangles, trapezoids, and crescents. What were they for? Some suggest they were parts of more complex multi-barbed weapons. Others wonder if the specific shape was a kind of cultural signature, a way for different groups to identify their equipment, like a family crest on an arrow. Could it be that the difference between a triangular or a crescent-shaped barb wasn't about function at all, but about identity? We see the tools, but we can only guess at the complex layers of meaning and tradition that guided the hands of the people who made them. So, with these ingenious kits of stone and bone tucked into their bags of hide, let us imagine the people who carried them. Picture a small group, perhaps an extended family of no more than 20 individuals, moving slowly through the birch and pine woodland that covers the gentle slopes of western Doggerland. They are cloaked in the cured skins of deer and elk, the fur turned inwards for warmth against the persistent dampness of the northern air. Their faces are weathered by wind and sun, and their dark eyes are constantly scanning, reading the landscape with a fluency we can barely comprehend. They are watching for the flick of a deer's ear in the undergrowth, for the circling of a bird that might signal a predator nearby, for the subtle change in vegetation that speaks of wetter ground ahead. They are not marching towards a destination on a map. Their map is etched into their minds by the stories of their elders and the experience of the seasons. They are simply following the pull of possibility, moving towards a horizon that promises more game, more resources, and perhaps more solitude. They come to a river, one of the great slow arteries of Doggerland, wider and more sluggish than any river in Britain today. On the far side, the land seems to rise a little more steeply. It is not a dramatic change, just a subtle lift in the landscape, a place that might offer a drier camp and a better vantage point. They would have crossed, not in a bridge-building frenzy, but with patience and knowledge. Perhaps they used a log jam, a natural bridge of fallen trees, or waded through a shallow ford they knew from previous seasons. Or maybe they used a simple hide boat, a coracle-like craft, to ferry their children and their precious toolkits across the brown, swirling water. The sounds would have been the splash of their feet, the quiet calls of waterfowl disturbed by their passage, and the murmur of their voices, speaking a language lost to time, a language whose every word for tree, animal, and stone is now gone forever. As they climb the bank on the other side, their feet press into the damp soil. Without knowing it, without any sense of occasion, they have just taken the first human steps on the landmass that will, in a few thousand years, become an island. This is the moment archaeologists have been searching for, the faint signal in the noise of deep time that marks the beginning of the Mesolithic in Britain. The earliest confirmed sites, places where we have found the distinctive flint tools of these pioneers, date to around 9000 BC. That's 11,000 years ago. One of the most significant is a place now in North Yorkshire, a landscape that was then on the edge of a vast post-glacial lake. Here, archaeologists found a scatter of tiny flint blades and the debris from their manufacture, lying exactly where they had been dropped by a person sitting on the shore, perhaps looking out over the water, restocking their toolkit for the hunt ahead. It is an incredibly intimate and poignant scene to imagine. We have the physical evidence of a single moment of quiet industry, a snapshot of a life lived in a world utterly alien to our own. But this single, precious sight raises more questions than it answers, opening up the central mystery of this pioneering age. Who exactly were these first people? And how did they arrive? Was it a great migration? A wave of people purposefully moving into the empty lands? Or was it something far more gradual and haphazard? The prevailing theory is that it wasn't a single event at all. It was likely a slow, generational trickle. For centuries, the lands of what would become Britain were probably the far edge of a much larger territory, a seasonal hunting ground visited by groups whose main home territories were still centered in Doggerland, or what is now northern France or Belgium. They were not colonists in the way we might think of them, arriving with a flag and a plan. They were simply hunters expanding their range, following the herds of aurochs and red deer as they moved into the new woodlands. The population would have been astonishingly small. Some estimates suggests that for the first 1,000 years, the total number of people in the entirety of Britain may have been just a few hundred individuals, a handful of family bands roaming a wilderness the size of a modern country. This scarcity of people makes them almost invisible in the archaeological record. They were ghosts on the landscape. They built no permanent houses, no monuments, no cities. Their lives were a continuous journey, a seasonal round of movement, leaving behind only the most ephemeral of traces: the charcoal from a dead campfire, the discarded bones from a meal, a lost flint arrowhead. Finding evidence of their presence is like searching for a handful of dropped needles in a forest that has since grown, died, and been replaced 10 times over. Each tiny microlith, each charred hazelnut shell we find from this earliest period is a miracle of survival, a message in a bottle that has washed up on the shores of the present. The great historiographical debate, then, is about the character of this settlement. Did these first groups stick to the coasts and the major river valleys, the prehistoric superhighways that offered the easiest travel and the most reliable resources? Or were there bold, adventurous groups who pushed deep into the interior, into the newly forested uplands? The evidence is so slight that a single new discovery, a new scatter of flints in a remote valley, could completely rewrite our understanding of how this vast, empty land was slowly, cautiously, and courageously repeopled by our distant ancestors. The world these first few families inhabited was not an empty one. It was a landscape of giants, not the lumbering mammoths and woolly rhinos of the deep ice age. Those were already ghosts, their bones sinking into the cold mud of Doggerland's riverbeds. The giants of this new, warmer age were the aurochs, Bos primigenius, the wild ancestor of all domestic cattle, and an animal of such power and ferocity that it would haunt the European imagination for the next 10,000 years, a creature of myth long after the last one had fallen. To picture an aurochs is to take the image of a modern bull and amplify it to a terrifying degree. A large male could stand 6 feet tall at the shoulder, a solid black wall of muscle and hide, weighing well over a ton. It was a prehistoric tank, crowned with a pair of immense, forward-curving horns, pale with black tips, that could span 4 feet from point to point. This was not a placid, cud-chewing bovine. The aurochs was notoriously aggressive, quick to anger, and astonishingly fast when it chose to be. For a small human group, armed with nothing more than the tools we have discussed, those elegant but ultimately fragile weapons of flint, wood, and sinew. Even consider hunting. Such a creature seems like an act of collective madness. And yet they did. We know they did from the bones left behind at their camps, aurochs' vertebrae and ribs, cracked open to get at the rich marrow inside. The aurochs was the ultimate prize. A single successful hunt could provide a small band with a mountain of meat, enough to sustain them for weeks. Its hide could provide shelter and clothing, its bones could be fashioned into tools, and its sinew could be used for bowstrings and bindings. It was a walking superstore of resources, but one that was very, very well guarded. So how, in this dense new woodland, where a charge could come from any direction, did they manage it? The hunt would not have been a spontaneous act of bravery, but a masterpiece of planning, patience, and profound ecological knowledge. It would have begun with tracking. Days, perhaps weeks, would be spent observing a herd, learning its habits, its daily routines, the paths it took to water, the clearings where it grazed. The hunters would have become shadows, moving silently through the undergrowth, their senses alive to the slightest sign, freshly broken branch, the print of a massive hoof in the mud, the distant lowing call, carrying on the damp air. Their target would not have been the dominant bull, the massive leader of the herd. That would have been suicide. Instead, they would have looked for a weakness, an opportunity. Perhaps a young, inexperienced individual that had strayed from the group, or an older animal, one that was past its prime, its movements a little slower, its reactions a little less sharp. The key was isolation. They needed to separate their chosen animal from the formidable defensive wall of the herd. This might have involved a slow, subtle pressure, a kind of psychological warfare. A sudden noise from one side, a fleeting movement on the other, all designed to gently nudge the target animal away from its companions to create a space, an opening. The forest itself was their accomplice. They knew its terrain intimately, the places where the ground was soft and marshy, where a heavy animal might get bogged down, the narrow ravines where its movement could be restricted, the dense thickets where it could be entangled. The hunt was as much about landscape architecture as it was about weaponry. Then, when the moment was right, the attack would have been swift, coordinated, and likely from a distance. A volley of those microlith-tipped arrows flying from the cover of the trees. We must be clear, a single one of these arrows would not have killed an aurochs. It would have been little more than a wasp's sting, a painful annoyance that would have sent the beast into a frenzy of rage. The goal was not an instant kill. The goal was to wound, to weaken, to begin a slow process of attrition. And this brings us to one of the most debated mysteries of Mesolithic hunting. Is it possible they used poison? Ethnographic evidence from other hunter-gatherer societies around the world shows the widespread use of potent toxins derived from plants, like hellebore or yew, smeared onto arrowheads. Such poisons would not leave any direct archaeological trace, but they would have been a game changer, turning a superficial wound into a fatal one. We can imagine the hunters, after loosing their arrows, melting back into the forest, not pursuing immediately, but waiting. They would have followed the wounded, enraged animal from a safe distance, watching, listening, waiting for the poison to do its work, for the great beast to slow, to stumble, and finally to fall. This theory remains just that, a hypothesis. Without the direct evidence, some archaeologists argue that it was simply the combined trauma of multiple wounds and the resulting blood loss that brought the animal down. Whatever the method, the final moments would have been perilous, requiring immense courage to approach the dying giant and deliver the final killing blow with a flint-tipped spear. The silence that fell afterwards, broken only by the panting breaths of the hunters and the buzzing of the first flies, would have been profound. In that silence lay the difference between starvation and survival, a testament to the fact that in this new world, the greatest power lay not in brute strength, but in the quiet, deadly intelligence of the human mind. The echoes of that successful aurochs hunt, the communal effort, and the life-sustaining reward would have centered on a hearth, a place of warmth and safety, a temporary home in the vast wilderness. For decades, archaeologists could only dream of finding such a place, a site so perfectly preserved that it felt less like a collection of artifacts and more like a room that its occupants had just stepped out of. they dreamt of a Mesolithic Pompeii, a moment frozen in time. And then, in a damp, peat-filled corner of Yorkshire, they found it. Its name is Starkar, and it is arguably the most important Mesolithic site in all of Europe. It is here that the ghosts of the pioneers become flesh and blood, where we can move beyond the generalities of survival and begin to ask far more profound questions about who these people were, what they believed, and how they saw their place in the world. To visit Starkar today is, on the surface, underwhelming. It is a flat, unremarkable field in the Vale of Pickering. But 11,000 years ago, this was the edge of a vast, shallow lake, fringed with a dense forest of birch and aspen. The ground would have been marshy, a wetland paradise teeming with life. And it is this waterlogged, oxygen-poor environment that we have to thank for the miracle of Starkar. While in most places, organic materials like wood, bone, and leather rot away to nothing in a matter of years, the peat bog at Starkar acted as a perfect preservative, sealing away the secrets of its inhabitants for 11 millennia. The site was discovered in 1947 by an amateur archaeologist named John Moore, who noticed unusual flints in a newly dredged ditch. What he and the archaeologists who followed him would uncover would change our understanding of the Mesolithic forever. They found not a village, but what appears to have been a seasonal encampment, a place returned to again and again, likely in the summer months. They found the remains of what might be the earliest evidence of carpentry in Britain. A wooden platform made of split timbers laid down on the muddy shore of the lake. Was this a foundation for a shelter? A simple jetty for launching dugout canoes? Or a place to process kills and prepare hides? The debate continues. They found incredible evidence of their diet, the bones of red deer, elk, roe deer, aurochs, and boar. But they also found the bones of smaller creatures, pine martens, foxes, beavers, and the remains of at least 33 different species of birds, from cranes to ducks. This was a community with a varied and sophisticated palate, masters of their wetland environment, and they found tools, not just the tens of thousands of flint microliths, but beautifully crafted harpoon points made from red deer antler, with sharp barbs meticulously carved along their edges. They found tightly rolled up sheets of birch bark, perhaps used for making containers, or for their flammable tarry resin. We see a picture of a competent, well-established community living in a resource-rich environment. But then, amongst all these practical, everyday objects, they found something else. Something that speaks not of survival, but of a rich and mysterious inner world. They found the frontlets. Out of the dark, wet peat, the excavators lifted at least 21 red deer skulls, but they had been strangely and deliberately modified. The majority of the skull had been cut away, leaving only the top part, the frontlet, with the magnificent antlers still attached. The inside of the skull plate had been painstakingly scraped and hollowed out, making it lighter, and in many of them, small holes had been drilled into the sides. The conclusion was inescapable. These were not simply the leftovers from butchery. They were designed to be worn. They were masks, headdresses, crowns of bone and antler that would have transformed the wearer into something else entirely. A human-deer hybrid, a spirit of the forest made manifest. Imagine the sheer effort, the dangerous hunt for a magnificent stag, the careful skinning and butchering, and then The long, patient hours of work with a flint burren, chipping and scraping and drilling to create one of these incredible objects. This then is the great mystery of Starkar. What on earth were they for? The most prosaic explanation, the one you might reach for first, is that they were a form of hunting disguise. The hunter, cloaked in deerskin and wearing the antlered crown, could creep closer to the herd, fooling the famously sharp-sensed animals. It's an appealingly practical idea, but one that falls apart under a little scrutiny. Red deer are not easily fooled by sight alone. Their sense of smell is phenomenal, and these frontlets would have been heavy, cumbersome, and noisy, snagging on every low branch. It seems an incredibly elaborate and likely ineffective method for a people whose survival depended on efficiency. So we are pushed into a deeper, more mysterious realm. Could they have been ceremonial? Perhaps worn during ritual dances, where the story of the hunt was reenacted, honoring the spirit of the deer and ensuring future success. Picture a firelit clearing by the lakeside at dusk, the figures moving in a rhythmic dance, their antlered silhouettes flickering against the flames. Or were they the regalia of a shaman, a spiritual leader who would don the headdress to enter a trance, to travel to the spirit world, to communicate with the animal spirits that governed their world and held the keys to life and death? In this view, the wearer wasn't just pretending to be a deer. For a time, they became the deer, blurring the sacred line between the human and the animal. The fact that the frontlets were found in what seems to have been the wet, marshy edge of the site suggests they may have been deliberately deposited in the water at the end of their use life and offering back to the spirits of the lake. We will never know for sure. But in these enigmatic crowns of antler, we see the undeniable evidence of a complex symbolic and spiritual life. The people of Starkar were not just surviving. They were thinking, believing, and dreaming, leaving the enigmatic antler frontlets to rest in the quiet of the lakeside bog. Let's step away from the world of ritual and into the bustling, noisy, and no doubt very smelly reality of daily life at Starkar. Let's reconstruct the rhythm of a summer's day 11,000 years ago. The sun rises over the vast, reed-fringed lake, its light filtering through the canopy of birch and aspen. The air is thick with the morning mist, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the sharp, comforting smell of wood smoke from a hearth that has been kept alive through the night. The first sounds are not human, but the cacophony of the wetland waking up, the booming call of a bittern from the reeds, the splash of a fish in the shallows, the chattering of 1,000 birds. Then, from the low, hide-covered shelters clustered near the wooden platform, the first people emerge, stretching in the cool air. A day's work begins immediately, driven by the fundamental needs of warmth, water, and food. A child is sent to the lake's edge with a birch bark container to fetch clean water. The fire is built up from its glowing embers, fresh wood added until it crackles to life, becoming the center of the camp's gravity. It is the communal kitchen, the workshop, the social club. We know from finds at the site that the earliest domesticated dogs in Britain were part of this community. We can easily imagine them here, wolf-like in appearance, sniffing around the hearth for scraps, their barks a sudden, sharp alarm at any strange scent on the Winder vital security system in a world of predators. While we can't be certain about the division of labor, it's logical to assume tasks were shared according to skill, age, and strength. A group of men might prepare for a hunt, checking their bows and the sinew bindings on their flint arrowheads. Another group might take a newly crafted dugout canoe, a hollowed-out log, onto the still waters of the lake, armed with those barbed antler harpoons, to spear the large predatory pike that lurked in the weedy shallows. Back at the camp, life was a continuous hum of industry. Imagine a woman kneeling on a deerskin, a smooth, flat stone in front of her. She is processing hazelnuts, a vital source of protein and fat, cracking them open and grinding them into a nutritious paste. Others are working with hides from a recent kill, scraping them clean of flesh and fat with sharp-edged flint tools, preparing to tan them with birch oil and smoke to make them soft and waterproof for clothing or shelter. The sound of flint knapping would be a constant percussive backdrop to the day as a skilled individual sits, patiently striking flakes from a core to replenish the community's supply of essential cutting edges. And everywhere, there is the work of bone and antler. A broken piece of red deer antler isn't discarded. It is a precious raw material, soaked in water to soften it, then painstakingly scraped, grooved, and polished with abrasive sand to create a new harpoon point or a needle for sewing. This was a world of absolute material efficiency, where nothing was wasted. The concept of rubbish would have been utterly alien. As the day wears on, the fruits of their labor are brought back. A successful fishing trip yields a string of gleaming pike. A hunt may bring back a smaller roe deer, which is quickly and expertly butchered, the meat shared among the family groups. Cooking would have been simple and direct. Meat was likely roasted over the open fire on wooden spits, the fat dripping and sizzling into the flames. They had no pottery, so boiling food presented a challenge. One ingenious solution used by many prehistoric cultures is the pot-boiler method. A pit could be dug and lined with a waterproof hide, then filled with water. Stones, heated until they were glowing in the fire, would then be dropped into the water, bringing it to a rapid boil to make a simple broth or stew. They were not just surviving, they were thriving. The sheer variety of animal and bird bones at Starkar tells us their knowledge of their environment was encyclopedic. They knew which birds to hunt in which season, where the deer would come to drink, and what plants, roots, and fungi were safe to gather from the forest floor. This reconstruction of a busy, practical, and successful community leads us to a fascinating and still unresolved debate among archaeologists. What was Starkar, really? For a long time, it was viewed as a base camp, a place where a band of hunter-gatherers lived for a significant part of the year. But more recent analysis has challenged this. The sheer number of red deer antlers, particularly those modified into frontlets, and the deliberate placing of artifacts in the wet margins of the lake, have led some to propose a different theory. Perhaps Starkar was not a permanent home, but a special ritual site. Maybe it was primarily a hunting and processing camp, occupied for a few specific weeks in the summer when the stags were in their prime, the goal being not just to get meat, but to acquire the antlers, the potent symbols of power, and the raw material for those sacred masks. In this view, the camp was more of a seasonal, industrial, and religious center, a Mesolithic cathedral in the marshes, with the community's true home being a more mobile existence for the rest of the year. Was it a home or a holy site? The truth is, It was likely both. For these people, the practical and the spiritual were probably not separate categories as they are for us. The hunt was an economic necessity, but it was also a sacred act, steeped in ritual and respect. The life-giving lake was a place to fish, but also a place to make offerings. Life by the lakeside was a seamless blend of the mundane and the magical. We call it the Stone Age. It's a convenient label, a neat little box in the timeline of human history, and it's based on a simple, durable truth. Stone lasts. The flint tools, those microlithic components we've discussed, are the most common calling cards left behind by our Mesolithic ancestors. They litter the ancient landscapes of Britain, tough, resilient, and almost eternal. But to call it the Stone Age is a profound misrepresentation. It would be like calling our own era the Plastic and Glass Age, just because those are the materials most likely to survive in the landfill of the far future. The Mesolithic was not, in its soul, an age of stone. It was, far more intimately and essentially, an age of wood. Wood was the raw material that framed their existence. It provided the shafts for their arrows and spears, the handles for their flint knives, the frames for their shelters, the fuel for their fires, and the very boats that carried them across the water. Yet, this entire world of wood has almost completely vanished, consumed by millennia of damp, decay, and digestion, by the microorganisms of the soil. It is the great ghost of the archaeological record, a vast invisible architecture of which we only ever glimpse the faintest of outlines, except, once again, at Starkar. The same waterlogged peat that preserved the antler frontlets also held the wooden world of its people in suspended animation. Here, we can reach through time and touch the fibers of their craftsmanship, and what we find is breathtaking. The most substantial wooden artifact, mentioned before, is the platform. Let us consider for a moment what it took to build it. Sometime around 8070 BC, the people by the lake felled a number of mature birch, alder, and aspen trees, some up to 1/2 meter in diameter. They did this with stone axes, a slow, patient process of chipping away at the base, the rhythmic thud of stone on wood echoing across the water. Then came the truly remarkable part. Using only stone and antler wedges, they managed to split these large logs lengthways into planks and timbers. This is not a simple task. It requires a profound intuitive understanding of the grain of the wood, knowing exactly where to place the wedge and how to strike it to achieve a clean, straight split. It is the work of a master carpenter, someone who knew their materials as intimately as a modern luthier knows a piece of maple. These timbers were then laid down in the boggy ground at the lake's edge, creating a stable, dry surface over 16 square meters. This wasn't just a pile of logs. It was construction, a deliberate and skillful manipulation of the environment. Perhaps the most personal and evocative wooden object pulled from the peat at Starkar is a paddle. It is the oldest known example of boat propulsion from Europe, carved from a single piece of birch. It is just under 1 meter long, its blade a long, elegant leaf shape, beautifully worked and smoothed. You can almost feel it in your hands, the light weight of the birch, the smoothness of the handle polished by the grip of its owner. You can imagine the person who used it, kneeling in a dugout canoe on the still, misty surface of the lake at dawn, the paddle dipping silently into the dark water, leaving a trail of gentle ripples behind. This one object speaks volumes. It confirms they had sophisticated watercraft. It shows their mastery of woodworking, and it gives us a tangible link to a single human being on a single journey, on a single day, 11,000 years ago. The wooden artifacts found at Stakar and a handful of other waterlogged sites across Europe open a window into this lost world of craft. We find beautifully woven fish traps, complex structures of willow and hazel designed to funnel fish into a place where they could be easily speared or netted. We find wooden trackways, simple paths of logs, and branches laid across swamps to allow for safe passage. Each of these finds is a small miracle, but they also serve to highlight the great unanswered question of the period. If this is the quality of craftsmanship that we find in the few, rare places where wood survives, what have we lost everywhere else? The stone tools we find in their millions are only the tips, the blades, the functional edges. The vast majority of the object, the handle, the shaft, the hafties, gone. Every one of those tiny microliths implies a wooden component that has vanished. This is the great iceberg of Mesolithic archaeology. The stone tools we see are the 10% that is visible above the water. The 90% that is missing, the vast invisible bulk beneath the surface, is the world of organic materials. What else did they make? Did they carve wooden bowls and platters? Did they have wooden toys for their children? Did they carve effigies of animals or spirits, little wooden gods that they carried with them on their journeys? Objects that were imbued with meaning and power, but which rotted away in a single season, once lost. We have no way of knowing for sure. Our picture of their material culture is hopelessly, unavoidably skewed towards the non-perishable. The mystery, therefore, is one of imagination. We must look at the elegance of a flint arrowhead and try to imagine the equal elegance of the arrow shaft it was attached to. We must look at the skill displayed in the Stakar paddle and extrapolate that skill across a whole universe of lost objects. The people of the Mesolithic were not clumsy brutes living in a world of crude stone. They were masters of wood, fiber, and hide, and their world was likely far richer, more complex, and more beautifully crafted than the surviving stones could ever tell us. If the physical world of the Mesolithic, that rich and complex age of wood, is a ghost in the archaeological record, then what hope do we have of grasping the thoughts of the people who inhabited it, their beliefs, their fears, their stories, their cosmology? These things were not carved in wood, let alone stone. They were carried on the breath, in the lyrics of songs sung around a fire, in the quiet instructions of a parent to a child, in the intricate steps of a ritual dance. This is the deepest, most profound darkness of the past, a realm of thought and spirit that seems forever beyond our reach, and yet it is not entirely lost. Faint whispers of it remain, encoded in the strange and seemingly irrational things they did. By looking at the patterns in what they chose to throw away, where they chose to live, and how they treated their dead, we can begin to sketch the faint outlines of their spiritual landscape. The foundational idea, the one that most archaeologists believe underpins the Mesolithic mind, is animism. This is a worldview utterly different from our modern scientific one. For us, the world is largely made up of inanimate objects and forces, rocks, rivers, weather, with a thin layer of living things like plants and animals on top. For an animist, there is no such division. Everything is alive, Everything has a spirit, a will, a personality. The river you fish from is not just a body of water. It is a powerful being that can choose to give you fish or withhold them. The flint you nap is not just a piece of silica. It has a spirit that must be respected for it to fracture correctly. The ancient oak tree on the ridge is not just a plant. It is a grandparent, a silent witness to generations, a being to be consulted and appeased. In this world, humans are not the masters of nature. They are the junior partners in a vast, sentient community of beings, both visible and invisible. Survival is not just a matter of technical skill. It is a constant, delicate act of diplomacy, a life spent maintaining right relationships with the powerful other than human persons who share the world with you. We can see the glimmers of this worldview in the things they left behind. Remember those antler frontlets from Starkar? They are our strongest clue. In an animistic, shamanic tradition, the shaman is the ultimate diplomat, the specialist who can travel between the world of humans and the world of spirits. By donning the antlers and skin of a red deer, the shaman was not just putting on a costume. Through trance, induced by drumming, dancing, and perhaps hallucinogenic plants, they would cross a threshold of consciousness and become the deer spirit. In this form, they could travel to the spirit world to ask for a successful hunt, to find the cause of a sickness, or to guide the spirits of the dead. The deer masks were not just art. They were technology, the sacred hardware for accessing the spiritual internet that connected all things. This idea of a constant negotiation with the spirit world helps explain one of the most puzzling features of Mesolithic archaeology: deliberate deposition. All over Britain and Europe, archaeologists find perfectly good, sometimes exquisitely made, tools in places where they have no business being. At the bottom of lakes, buried in peat bogs, dropped into the fissures of caves. We find caches of beautiful, unused flint axes, harpoons of bony and antler, showing no signs of wear, all carefully placed in watery liminal spaces. For a long time, this was simply interpreted as people being clumsy, losing their best spear while fishing. But the pattern is too consistent. A far more powerful explanation is that these were not losses. They were gifts. They were votive offerings. In the animist mindset, if you are to take something from the world, the life of a salmon from the river, for example, you must give something back to maintain balance. What better gift to the spirit of the river than your most beautiful, most skillfully made harpoon? It was an act of respect, an investment in a future relationship, a way of saying thank you. This practice of placing valuable objects in water would continue for thousands of years, a deep tradition whose roots lie right here in the spiritual landscape of the first inhabitants. If their world was alive with spirits, their relationship with their own dead is far more mysterious. Burials from the British Mesolithic are incredibly rare, so rare that for a long time we had none at all. This in itself is a profound statement. Unlike the later Neolithic peoples, who would build massive tombs and monuments to their ancestors, the Mesolithic people seem to have had a very different conception of death and remembrance. What does this lack of graves mean? This is one of the period's great open questions. One theory is excarnation. They may have exposed their dead on platforms, leaving the bodies to be consumed by the elements and by scavenging birds and animals, a process that would return the body to the cycle of nature and release the spirit. Another possibility is that the dead were returned to the water, committed to the same rivers and lakes where they made their offerings, their bodies sinking into the keeping of the spirits there. Or perhaps they practiced cremation, with the ashes scattered to the winds, leaving no archaeological trace. The few burials we do have, like a man found in Avalon's Hole in Somerset, buried in a crouched position, offer tantalizing but incomplete clues. We are left with a powerful impression of a people who did not feel the need to monumentalize their dead, perhaps because their ancestors were not confined to a single grave. In an animistic world, the ancestors were everywhere. In the wind, in the calls of the birds, in the living landscape itself. There was no need to build a house for the dead when the entire world was their home. The spiritual landscape we have just wandered through, with its offerings to water spirits and its sky burials for the dead, fits so neatly with a particular image we have of our Mesolithic ancestors. It is the image of the eternal wanderer, a people of profound skill and intelligence, yes, but a people untethered to any one place, their lives dictated by the seasonal movements of animals and the ripening of plants. Their homes, we have always assumed, were as ephemeral as their lives. Simple hide tents or brushwood shelters, erected for a few weeks and then dismantled, leaving behind nothing more than a few post holes and the faint stain of a campfire. For generations of archaeologists, this was the accepted truth. Mesolithic people did not build houses. They built camps. They did not settle. They passed through. And then, on a windy stretch of coastline in Northumberland, overlooking the cold grey waters of the North Sea, a discovery was made that invited us to tear up that old, comfortable script. They found a house. The place is called Howick. In 2000, archaeologists were investigating a flint scatter on a cliff edge, the kind of typical, unassuming site that dots the British coastline. They expected to find the usual story, a temporary camp where a small group had stopped to make tools and perhaps cook a meal before moving on. But as they began to dig, the story changed. They started to uncover not just a scatter, but a pattern. A distinct, dark circle began to emerge in the sandy soil, studded with the even darker, deeper stains of post holes. This was not the random debris of a fleeting visit. This was architecture. What they had found was the sunken floor of a large circular building, a Mesolithic dwelling dating to around 7,800 BC. At the time of its discovery, it was the earliest house in all of Britain. Let's step inside. To do so, you first have to descend. The floor of the Howick house was deliberately dug about a meter deep into the sand, creating a pit house. This was a clever piece of thermal engineering. By sinking the dwelling into the earth, its inhabitants were using the ground itself as a massive insulator, protecting them from the relentless coastal winds and the biting cold of the northern winters. The shape was a near-perfect circle, about 6 meters in diameter, spacious enough for an extended family. Around the edge of this pit, a ring of large post holes showed where the main timber uprights of the structure would have stood. These would have been substantial wooden posts, forming a strong conical or beehive-shaped frame. We can imagine this frame being expertly thatched with reeds from a nearby marsh, or covered with thick layers of turf, creating a snug, weatherproof, and remarkably solid home. At the center of the floor was a main hearth, its clay lining baked hard by countless fires, its layers of ash and charcoal telling a story of repeated use over a very long time. Other smaller hearths were dotted around the interior, perhaps for specific tasks or for individual family groups to have their own small pocket of warmth. The people who lived here were not just surviving, they were comfortable. Inside this home, the sound of the wind howling off the North Sea would have been a dull, distant roar. The air would have been warm, thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasting fish, and the scent of human life. The light from the central fire would have cast flickering shadows on the wooden walls, illuminating the faces of the family within as they worked on tools, told stories, or simply slept, safe from the predators and the elements outside. The archaeological evidence tells us they were masters of their coastal territory. They left behind the bones of wild boar and the charred shells of thousands upon thousands of hazelnuts, gathered from the woodlands that then grew much closer to the coast. This was a home with a full larder. But what truly sets the Howick house apart is the evidence for its longevity. The analysis of the hearths and the layers of sediment within the sunken floor suggest it wasn't just used for a single winter. It seems to have been occupied, perhaps not continuously, but certainly returned to and reused for over 100 years. That's 5 generations of people who may have called this one specific spot home. This is the bomb that the Howick house drops into our neat theories of the wandering Mesolithic. A house that stands for a century is not the work of people who are just passing through. It is an investment. It is a statement of intent. It implies a completely different relationship with the landscape. And this leads to the great mystery of Howick. Was it unique? Was this one family, in this one place, an odd, eccentric group who decided to break with millennia of tradition and build a permanent home? Or is the opposite true? Is Howick the sole survivor, a lucky accident of preservation on a coastline that has otherwise been eroded and washed away by the rising seas? Is it possible that the coastlines of Mesolithic Britain were dotted with such settlements, little clusters of solid, turf-covered homes, a whole settled world that has been almost entirely lost to us? This hypothesis suggests a more complex picture of Mesolithic life, not a simple binary of nomadic versus settled, but a spectrum. Perhaps some groups remained highly mobile in the interior, while others, particularly on the coast, where resources like seals, fish, and seabirds were abundant and reliable year-round, adopted a more sedentary life. The people of Howick were not farmers, but they had found a place so rich, so reliable, that they could stop wandering. For the first time, we can see in the archaeological record, not just a campsite, but a place with an address. The solid, earth-banked house at Howick stands as a powerful testament to the idea of home, a fixed point in a spinning world. But for every group that chose to anchor themselves to a single, rich stretch of coastline, there were likely dozens more who still followed the ancient wandering rhythm of the seasons. For them, home was not a place you built, but a journey you took. It was a vast territory, a familiar map of hills, rivers, and valleys held in their collective memory, and their lives were a continuous, elegant dance with the changing resources of this landscape. To understand this other, more mobile way of life, we must leave the warmth of the Howick hearth and join a small family band as they begin their yearly journey, their seasonal round. Let us find them in autumn. The air is growing crisp, and the leaves of the birch and hazel are turning a brilliant, fleeting yellow. This is a season of urgency and abundance, the last great feast before the lean months of winter. The focus of their days is the hazelnut. For weeks, the entire group, from the oldest members to the youngest children, is engaged in a massive harvesting operation. They move through the dense hazel thickets that flourish in the woodland clearings, stripping the branches of their bounty, filling woven bags and hide containers with the small, hard-shelled nuts. Back at their temporary camper, simple cluster of hide tents in a sheltered clearing, the nuts are processed. Some are eaten immediately, roasted in the embers of the fire until they are fragrant and sweet. But the vast majority are painstakingly cracked, their rich kernels ground into a thick, oily, and incredibly nutritious paste. This is their winter insurance policy, a high-energy food source that can be stored for months. At the same time, the hunters are taking advantage of the animals, now fat from a summer of grazing. A successful hunt for a red deer or a wild boar is a major event, providing not just meat to be eaten fresh and smoked for later, but also a fresh supply of hides, sinew, and bone for the winter's crafting. As the first hard frosts bite and the days shorten dramatically, the band makes its most important move of the year. They abandon their autumn camp in the open woodland and travel to their winter home. This might be a place like Howick, a sheltered spot on the coast where the sea tempers the worst of the cold and provides a reliable source of food. Or it could be a deep, wooded river valley, protected from the prevailing winds. Here, they might reoccupy a site used by their ancestors for generations, perhaps even a pit house similar to Howick's, but used only for this one season. Winter is a time of contraction. The world shrinks to the circle of firelight. The days are spent on tasks that can be done in the confines of the shelter. Reshafting arrows, sewing new clothes from the autumn hides with a fine bone needle, and meticulously pressure flaking new microliths from a flint core brought from a distant quarry. Food is carefully rationed. They rely on their stores of hazelnut paste and smoked meat, supplementing them with whatever the harsh landscape will offer. They might set traps for smaller, fur-bearing animals like pine martens and foxes, their pelts a vital extra layer of warmth. If they are near a frozen lake, the men might lie patiently on the ice, cloaked in furs, waiting to spear a pike through a hole cut in the ice. But winter is also a social time, with the relentless pressure of the hunt eased. This is the season for storytelling, for passing down the myths and the histories of the people, for reinforcing the bonds of kinship that are the ultimate key to their survival. The first thaw is a signal of release. As the ice on the rivers begins to break up with a groan and a crack, and the first green shoots of wild garlic appear on the forest floor, the band prepares to move again. The mood is one of restless energy. They are tired of their winter quarters, tired of the same food, and eager for the renewal that spring promises. They pack up their few belongings and begin to travel, breaking up into smaller family units, dispersing across the landscape. Their destination is the rivers. Spring is the season of the great fish runs, as salmon and sea trout, heavy with roe, surge up the waterways from the sea to their spawning grounds. This is a brief but spectacular glut of food. The people would build simple weirs of wood and stone to funnel the fish into narrow channels where they could be easily speared with those barbed antler harpoons we saw at Starkar. It is also the time when great flocks of migratory birds return, their calls filling the air. The skies over the wetlands and estuaries would be dark with them, and they were an easy and welcome source of fresh meat after the long winter. As the days grow long and warm, the groups move again, this time climbing from the river valleys to the higher ground of the uplands. This is their summer territory. The dense forests of the lowlands can be dark and difficult to move through in midsummer, but the open moorlands and hilltops offer a cooling breeze and, crucially, a better view. Here they follow the herds of red deer and aurochs, who have also moved to the high pastures to graze. This might be the time and place for large social gatherings. Several different family bands who had spent the winter apart might arrange to meet at a traditional location, a place like Starkar by a lake or a particular bend in a river. Here they would exchange news, trade high-quality flint from their different territories, arrange marriages, and perform the shared rituals that bound them together as a people. And this brings us to a deep archaeological puzzle. How were these territories understood? Did each band have an exclusive right to a particular area, a home range that they would defend from outsiders? Or were the boundaries more fluid, with different groups having rights to different resources within an overlapping landscape? We see hints in the way stone from specific sources travels hundreds of miles, suggesting a network of exchange and contact, not a landscape of hard borders. Their map was not one of property lines, but of relationships, a complex web of kinship and obligation that dictated who could hunt, where, and when. Their journey through the seasons was not just a search for food. It was a way of renewing the social and spiritual ties that made them who they were. The seasonal round we have just followed, that elegant and efficient journey from the autumn nut harvest to the summer hunting grounds, took place against a backdrop that was itself in a state of profound and constant transformation. The landscape was not a static stage for the human drama. It was an active and powerful character in the story, and over the course of a few thousand years, its costume changed completely. The early Mesolithic world, the world of Starkar and the pioneers, was a landscape of light and air. It was a mosaic of open birch and pine woodland, vast wetlands, and grassy clearings. The horizons were distant, and movement, while not always easy, was at least conceivable. You could see where you were going, but as the climate continued to warm, a new army of life began its slow, silent, and inexorable march from the south. An invasion that would utterly reshape Britain and the lives of the people who called it home. This was the arrival of the wildwood. First came the hazel, a fast-growing, opportunistic shrub that formed dense, low thickets. Then, following close behind, came the true giants, the elm, the oak, and the lime. These were the climax species, the slow-growing, long-lived titans of the forest, seeded by birds and small mammals, or creeping forward generation by generation. They began to claim the land. They pushed out the light-loving birch and pine, their broad leaves creating a canopy so thick and overlapping that it cast the forest floor into a permanent, green-tinged twilight. By around 6000 BC, the process was largely complete. From the south coast of England to the highlands of Scotland, Britain was wrapped in a single, near-continuous blanket of dense, temperate rainforest. This was a forest unlike any that exists in Britain today. This was the wildwood, a place of myth and of a deep, primal wildness. To step into this forest would have been like entering a different realm. The air was still and humid, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and blossoming flowers. The silence was profound, broken not by the distant lowing of an aurochs, but by the sudden close-up snap of a twig, the chatter of a squirrel, or the fluting call of a bird high in the unseen canopy. Light was a precious commodity, dappled and shifting, falling in bright shafts that illuminated clouds of dancing insects before vanishing again. The ground was a chaotic tangle of fallen trees, their moss-covered trunks like sleeping giants, their root blades torn from the earth, leaving deep pits and high mounds that made walking a constant stumbling effort. This was not a managed woodland of straight-trunked trees. It was a wilderness of ancient gnarled oaks, of ivy-strangling elms, and a dense, competitive understory of holly and hazel fighting for any scrap of light. For the hunter, this new world presented a formidable challenge. The herds of wild horse and reindeer that had roamed the open landscapes were long gone. The aurochs and red deer, the great prizes of the hunt, were still here. But they were now dispersed, harder to track, and far more dangerous in the close confines of the deep woods. A hunt was no longer a game of long-distance observation and pursuit. It became a contest of stealth, nerve, and intimate, almost claustrophobic proximity. This dramatic environmental shift has created one of the great historical debates about the Middle Mesolithic period. The traditional view, for a long time, was that the arrival of the wildwood was a disaster for the hunter-gatherer population. This dense, dark forest was seen as a green desert. It was argued that the large grazing animals became scarcer, and the sheer difficulty of moving through the landscape would have fragmented the human population, leading to a decline in numbers and a retreat to the more open and resource-rich coastlines and river valleys. In this interpretation, the Mesolithic people were passive victims of climate change, their way of life choked by the very success of the forest. It's a compelling narrative, but is it true? More recently, a far more complex and interesting hypothesis has emerged. It suggests that Mesolithic people were not passive victims at all, but active and sophisticated managers of their new woodland environment. They were, in a sense, the first foresters. The key to this theory is fire. We know from charcoal layers in the soil and pollen analysis that there were frequent small-scale fires in the Mesolithic landscape. While some of these would have been natural lightning strikes, it's highly likely that many were deliberately set. By carefully burning patches of the undergrowth, they could create clearings in the otherwise impenetrable forest. These clearings would have been magnets for animals. The new growth of grasses, herbs, and young shrubs in the wake of a fire would attract herbivores like red deer, roe deer, and wild boar, concentrating them in predictable locations and making them easier to hunt. It would also encourage the growth of useful plants like hazel, a vital food source. This wasn't slash-and-burn agriculture. It was a subtle, sustainable form of landscape manipulation, a kind of Mesolithic forest gardening. They were not just hunting in the forest. They were helping to shape it to their own needs. This idea transforms our view of them from simple foragers to ecosystem engineers, people with a deep, practical knowledge of how to work with their environment, not just against it. The mystery lies in the scale and intention of this activity. Was it a widespread, conscious strategy, or a more localized, opportunistic one? Proving it is incredibly difficult, but it forces us to imagine a far more dynamic relationship between the people and the wildwood, a constant dialogue written in smoke and ash. The forest was not an enemy to be conquered, but a partner to be negotiated with, a powerful, living entity that they learned to nudge and guide, creating a world that was both wild and, in its own subtle way, human. That dense, primeval wildwood, which had swallowed the open plains and cast the land into a deep green twilight, presented its human inhabitants with a fundamental problem of movement. To travel on land was to engage in a constant, frustrating battle with the landscape. Every journey was a slow, arduous process of pushing through thorny thickets, scrambling over fallen giants, and navigating by the subtle shifts in the canopy overhead. It was claustrophobic, disorienting, and inefficient. But the people of the Mesolithic had a secret, a way to bypass this terrestrial obstacle course entirely. They had their own superhighway network, a series of broad, shining avenues that crisscrossed the entire country, offering speed, efficiency, and a direct line of sight. They simply took to the water. In the world of the wildwood, the rivers and the coastlines were not barriers to be crossed. They were the very arteries of life, travel, and communication. Let us imagine two families living 20 miles apart in the dense forests of a Mesolithic river valley. For one to visit the other on foot would be a multi-day expedition, a perilous trek through an environment teeming with potential hazards. But in a dugout canoe, that same 20-mile journey could be completed in a single day of leisurely paddling. The rivers were the main roads, the trunk lines of their world. They were not the narrow, channeled, and fast-flowing rivers we see today, hemmed in by floodbanks and agricultural land. The Mesolithic River was a wilder, more sprawling entity, a braided network of channels, backwaters, and marshy islands, moving slowly and purposefully through the wooded lowlands towards the sea. On the quiet surface of this waterway, a small family group could glide almost silently, the rhythmic dip and pull of their paddles the only sound breaking the stillness. From the vantage point of the canoe, the forest that was so oppressive on land became a mere backdrop, a green wall on either side of their path. They could cover immense distances, moving from the summer hunting grounds in the uplands down to the coast for the winter, all by following the patient, guiding hand of the river. These liquid highways were crucial for more than just the seasonal round. They were the threads that stitched their entire society together. Remember the high-quality flint, a vital raw material, which is only found in specific geological locations. We find tools made from this specific flint hundreds of miles away from their source quarry. This is not because one heroic individual made an epic journey across the entire country. It's because the rivers facilitated a vast, down-the-line network of trade and exchange. A group living near the quarry would trade a batch of prepared flint cores with their neighbors downstream, who in turn would trade some with the next group, and so on, until a tool that began its life in a chalk hill in the south of England ended up being used by a hunter in a northern valley. The rivers were the conduits for goods, but also for news, for stories, and for genes. They connected disparate bands, allowing for the exchange of partners, preventing genetic isolation, and ensuring the health of the population. They were the social media network of the Mesolithic, a slow-moving but utterly reliable system for maintaining the relationships and alliances that were essential for survival. And of course, The waterways were a larder. The forest could be fickle, the deer elusive, but the river was a constant, predictable provider. We've spoken of the great seasonal runs of salmon and trout, a bonanza of protein that would have drawn people to the riverbanks in great numbers. But there was more. The slow-moving lower reaches were home to huge pike and eels, which could be speared or caught in ingeniously woven willow traps. The wetlands and estuaries that fringed the rivers were a paradise for bird life. A hunter in a canoe concealed by reeds could take his pick of ducks, geese, swans, and cranes. And the rivers were home to one of the Mesolithic's most valuable animals, the beaver, hunted not just for its meat, but for its incredibly warm, waterproof pelt and for its castoreum, an oily secretion that had medicinal uses. The beaver was a prize. The dams they built also created rich, ponded habitats that attracted even more fish and birds. A perfect example of the ecosystem engineering that the Mesolithic people would have understood and exploited. If the rivers were the highways, then the coastline was the grand central station, the bustling, vibrant capital city of their world. The coast was the ultimate ecotone, a place of explosive biological richness where multiple environments, the forest, the fresh water of the river estuaries, the brackish salt marshes, the intertidal zone, and the open sea all converged. This created a density and diversity of resources that was unmatched anywhere in the interior. A group living on the coast had access to everything the forest people had, plus an entire marine larder on their doorstep. This is what allowed for the settled life we saw at Howick. Why wander when everything you could possibly need was within a day's walk or paddle? They could hunt boar in the coastal woods in the morning, gather shellfish from the rock pools in the afternoon, and check their fish traps in the estuary at dusk. The coastline offered a level of food security that was simply unimaginable in the deep wildwood. This brings us to the great, tantalizing mystery of the coast. The Mesolithic coastline is not the coastline we see today. Over the last 10,000 years, the sea level has risen dramatically, drowning the low-lying coastal plains where these people would have spent most of their time. The camps and houses we find on the cliffs today, like Howick, may have been the equivalent of their hill farms, their summer homes, their true heartlands, their most populous settlements, their most sacred sites, are almost certainly now deep underwater. We see faint echoes of this lost world in the artifacts dredged from the seafloor, but the full picture is gone forever. A drowned world that holds the secret of whether Mesolithic Britain was a sparsely populated wilderness or a thriving, bustling maritime nation. If the rivers and coastlines were indeed the great, shimmering highways of the Mesolithic world, then every family, every small band of pioneers needed a vehicle. They needed a way to master these liquid roads, a technology that was both robust enough to carry their families and their gear, and elegant enough to be created from the raw materials of the forest, with nothing more than stone, fire, and an immense reserve of patience. The answer they found, a solution so perfect in its simplicity that it would remain in use for thousands of years, was the dugout canoe. These were not just boats. They were the keys that unlocked the entire landscape. To possess one was to transform the suffocating, tangled wildwood from a prison into a perfectly navigable map. And the story of how they were made is a testament to an almost forgotten form of genius, a conversation between the human mind, the living tree, and the transformative power of fire. The process did not begin with an axe, but with a walk in the woods. Choosing the right tree was the single most important decision in the entire venture, a choice that could determine the success or failure of weeks of future labor. The boat builder would have searched for a true giant, a titan of the forest, likely a straight-grained oak for its legendary durability, or perhaps a lime or pine, which were softer and easier to work. The tree needed to be not only tall and broad of girth, but also healthy, free from rot, and crucially, located as close as possible to the water's edge. Felling a multi-ton tree is one thing. Dragging it half a mile through a dense, chaotic forest is another challenge entirely. We can imagine the craftsmen spending days observing their chosen tree, walking around it, perhaps placing a hand on its rough bark, assessing its character, and maybe even making a small offering to its spirit before the work began. Felling this giant with stone tools seems an almost impossible task, but it was achieved through a clever and patient partnership with fire. A team of workers would have built a small controlled fire at the base of the trunk, letting the flames lick at the wood, charring it, weakening its structure. Then, using heavy stone axes and adzes beautifully polished stone heads hafted onto sturdy wooden handles, they would chip and hack away the blackened, brittle wood. Then another fire, more chipping, another fire, more chipping. It was a slow, rhythmic, and collaborative process that could take several days. The sounds would have been the crackle of the flames, the steady percussive thwack of stone on charred wood, and the murmur of voices coordinating their efforts, until at last, with a great tearing groan that would have echoed through the valley, the forest giant would fall. With the tree on the ground, the true artistry began. The log would be trimmed of its branches and rolled, using levers and sheer human effort, until it lay stable. Now came the hollowing. This too was a task for fire. Small, carefully managed fires were lit along the top surface of the log. The boat builders would have watched them with an eagle's eye, controlling the burn with damp moss and clay, ensuring it didn't get too hot or spread too wide. The goal was not to burn the boat, but to use the fire as a carving tool, a way to remove the bulk of the hardwood far more efficiently than stone tools ever could. After an area was sufficiently charred, the fire would be extinguished, and the workers would descend on the log with their stone adzes, their curved blades perfect for scooping out the soft black charcoal. Layer by layer, fire and stone, burn and scrape, they would slowly, painstakingly hollow out the log's interior. This was a process demanding incredible judgment. They had to constantly check the thickness of the hull, perhaps by drilling small holes and plugging them, or simply by the feel and the sound of the wood as they worked it, ensuring they didn't go too deep and create a fatal weakness. As the hollow deepened, the final shaping began. The bow and stern would be carved into a more streamlined shape to cut through the water with greater ease. The sides would be thinned and smoothed, the interior worked until it was comfortable for its occupants. The finished vessel was not a crude, lumpy trough. It was a sleek, sophisticated, and hydrodynamically efficient craft, each one unique, a perfect marriage of natural form and human intention. The largest surviving examples of these canoes are over 10 meters long, capable of carrying a whole family and their possessions. They were the Mesolithic equivalent of a family car and a moving van, all in one. This incredible technology naturally leads us to a great historiographical debate. Just what were these vessels capable of? The common conservative view is that they were primarily for inland navigation, for paddling up and down the calm, slow-moving rivers, and for fishing on the placid waters of the Great Lakes, like the one at Stakar. But were they limited to that? Some archaeologists and experimental boat builders have argued for a much greater capability. Could these dugouts have been seaworthy? With a high prow and enough freeboard, could a large oak dugout handle the chop of the coastal waters? Could it have been used for hunting sea mammals or for fishing in the open sea? The most tantalizing question of all is whether they were used for long-distance sea travel. Before Britain became an island, the Channel was just a very wide river. Could these vessels have been used to cross it? And even after the land bridge was finally severed, could Mesolithic mariners have made the journey across the open sea from what is now France to the shores of Kent? There is no definitive proof, but it's a thrilling possibility. It recasts the Mesolithic inhabitants of Britain not as a people marooned and isolated by the rising seas, but as a resourceful maritime culture, capable of building vessels that could brave the waves, maintaining links with the continent long after the land was gone. The humble dugout, born of fire and patience, may have been far more than a river taxi. It may have been the vessel that carried Britain's first people into the age of the island. The dugout canoe, that silent ghost on the water, carries our imagination towards the grand, dramatic moments of Mesolithic life. We picture it gliding towards a great stag drinking at the water's edge, or carrying a hunting party in pursuit of seals off a rocky coastline. Our minds are drawn to the flash of the antler harpoon, the thud of the stone axe, the heroic contest between man and beast. For a very long time, archaeology colluded in this drama. The story of our ancestors was written in bones and stones, the durable, butchered remains of their prey, and the sharp, flinty edges of their weapons. It was a story of meat, a narrative dominated by the hunt. But this picture is a profound distortion, a story told with only half of the script. The other half, the quieter, more patient, and arguably more important part of their economy, has been largely silent, not because it didn't exist, but because its evidence was as soft and perishable as a leaf. We have been so focused on man the hunter that we have forgotten woman the gatherer, and in doing so, we have missed the true secret to their success, a secret that grew on a humble shrub and could be held by the handful. This secret was the hazelnut. Before we dismiss this as a mere snack, a bit of trail mix for the prehistoric hiker, we must recalibrate our thinking entirely. For the people of Mesolithic Britain, the hazelnut was not just another food source, it was a staple, a cornerstone of their existence, the carbohydrate and fat-rich fuel that powered them through the lean winter months. The hazel is a remarkable plant. It is a pioneer, one of the first woody species to colonize the land after the ice receded, and it thrives in the open clearings and woodland edges that Mesolithic people may have actively maintained with fire. It grows quickly and produces vast, reliable crops of nuts year after year for a people whose lives were a constant negotiation with the uncertainty of the hunt. The reliability of the hazelnut harvest would have been a godsend. And nutritionally, the nut is a tiny miracle, a perfectly packaged parcel of energy, packed with fats, protein, and essential minerals. Let us return to that autumn camp we visited earlier in their seasonal round. the entire community would have been mobilized for the harvest. This was not a casual afternoon of foraging. This was an industrial-scale operation. For weeks, the forest would have been alive with the sounds of people moving through the hazel thickets, the rustle of leaves, the snapping of branches, and the steady rhythmic drumming of nuts being shaken onto hide sheets laid on the ground. We can imagine children scurrying up the flexible trunks to get at the highest clusters, their laughter echoing through the woods. The nuts would have been gathered in their thousands, their tens of thousands, and brought back to the camp in heavy baskets or hide bags. And here, the second phase of the operation would begin. Around the central hearths, the air would be thick with the sweet, toasty smell of roasting nuts. Pits would be dug, filled with nuts and embers, and then sealed with earth. The slow, gentle heat inside preserving the kernels and making their shells easier to crack. The evidence for this is overwhelming. At sites across Britain, from Howick on the coast of Northumberland to Stoursnaig on the Scottish island of Colonsay, archaeologists have found vast middens or refuse heaps composed almost entirely of charred hazelnut shells. We are not talking about a handful. We are talking about millions of shells compacted into thick black layers, a testament to a level of consumption that is almost impossible to imagine. These were not just snacks. This was the Mesolithic equivalent of a grain silo. This focus on hazelnuts solves a major biological puzzle. A diet based purely on lean meat, like that of deer, is a recipe for disaster. The human body cannot thrive on protein alone. It leads to a condition known as protein poisoning, which can be fatal. To survive, these people needed fat and carbohydrates, and the landscape of Mesolithic Britain offered few obvious sources. There was no sugarcane, no potatoes, no grains. The aurochs and the boar provided fat, but the hazelnut provided it in a storable, reliable, and abundant form. The sheer scale of the hazelnut processing suggests that they were creating a product that could see them through the winter. The roasted and shelled nuts might have been eaten whole, or more likely, pounded and ground on stone querns into a rich, oily paste or flour. Think of it as a kind of prehistoric peanut butter or Nutella. This paste could be stored for months in skin bags or bark containers. A dense, high-energy food that could be eaten on its own or mixed with water to make a gruel, providing the vital calories needed to survive the cold, dark months when other food was scarce. And this brings us to the great, tantalizing mystery of their vegetable diet. Hazelnuts, when charred, become almost indestructible little nuggets of carbon that can survive for 10,000 years. But what else were they eating? The wildwood would have been a vast edible pharmacy and larder for anyone who knew how to read it. They would have known the starchy, nutritious roots of reeds and water lilies, the sharp, vitamin-rich taste of wild garlic and sorrel, the sweet burst of wild raspberries and strawberries in the summer. They would have known which fungi were delicious and which were deadly. The problem is that none of these things, the leaves, the roots, the tubers, the berries, leave a ghost of a trace in the archaeological record, unless by some 1,000,000 to 1 chance they are charred and preserved. We are left with a picture of their diet that is almost certainly biased towards the indestructible. Were hazelnuts their one and only plant staple, the single pillar of their green economy? Or are we just seeing the tip of the iceberg? Modern science is beginning to offer new clues. Archaeologists can now analyze the microscopic starch grains left on the surfaces of grinding stones, or the pollen preserved in the calculus, the hardened plaque on ancient human teeth. This painstaking work is starting to reveal a much broader plant-based diet, hinting at the use of wild grains, tubers, and other plants that the hazelnut shells could never tell us about. But the picture is still emerging. And for now, we must look at those vast black layers of nutshells and imagine all the other colors of the forest's bounty that have vanished with time. The hunter's spear was vital, but it was the gatherer's basket, filled to the brim with the small, hard-won riches of the earth, that truly kept the home fires burning. While the people of the wildwood were perfecting their woodland economy, feasting on hazelnuts and following the deer through the deep forest, an older and far more powerful force was quietly working to reshape their world on a scale they could not possibly have comprehended. It was a force that had been set in motion thousands of years before, when the first great glaciers had begun their retreat. The rising of the sea. For us, living in an age where sea level change is measured in anxious millimeters per year, it is hard to grasp the sheer scale of what was happening. But for the inhabitants of Mesolithic Britain, this was not a sudden, dramatic crisis. It was a slow, patient, and utterly inexorable thief. A presence that stole their world, not by the meter, but by the generation. The process was driven by two immense geological engines working in tandem. The first was simple and global. The colossal ice sheets that had once buried half the continent were melting, and all that locked up water was returning to the world's oceans. This is called eustatic sea level rise. It was happening everywhere, from the coasts of Africa to the shores of Asia. But in Britain, this global effect was complicated by a second, more local, and more theatrical process. Imagine the landmass of Britain as a giant, semi-rigid mattress. For millennia, a colossal weight, the mile-thick Devensian ice sheet had been pressing down on the northern half, on Scotland. Now that the weight was removed, the north of the mattress was slowly, majestically springing back up. This is isostatic rebound. But as the north rose, the south of the mattress, the part that had been lifted slightly by the pressure in the north, began to sink back down. Britain was a geological seesaw. While Scotland was rising out of the sea, the south and east of England and the vast low-lying plains of Doggerland were sinking. It was a perfect storm. The oceans were rising, and the land itself was falling to meet them. From the perspective of a single human life, the change would have been almost imperceptible. An old man, sitting by a fire on the coast of what is now East Anglia, might have noticed that the highest winter storm tides seemed to creep a little further up the beach than they did when he was a boy. He might have told his grandchildren stories of a freshwater spring his father used to drink from, a place that was now tainted with the taste of salt at high tide. But these would have been small, personal observations, the kind of nostalgic laments for a changing world that old men have always made. The true scale of the transformation was only visible on a generational timescale. A journey that took 2 days for a grandfather might take his grandson 2.5, because a wide, marshy estuary now lay where a simple river crossing had once been. A sacred grove of oaks, a place where offerings had been made for centuries, might one day be found standing dead and grey, their roots poisoned by the slow, seeping intrusion of salt water into the soil. The first victim of this slow-motion flood was the very heartland of their world, Doggerland. Remember that vast, rich plain of rivers and woodlands that had served as the great highway into Britain? The rising sea did not attack it like a tidal wave, crashing over it in a single violent event. It infiltrated it slowly and insidiously from within. The great, slow-moving rivers that meandered across the Doggerland plain began to lose their gradient as their outlets to the sea rose. They became even more sluggish, backing up, their waters spreading out to create ever larger fens and marshes. The coastline, once a distant concept for people living in the center of the plain, began its long march inland. With every decade, the salty tang of the sea would have been carried further on the wind. The North Sea and the English Channel were not yet bodies of water as we know them. They were two vast, creeping marine embayments, two immense pincers of the Atlantic, slowly closing in on the lowlands from the north and the south. This transformation of the landscape must have been a profound, unfolding tragedy for the people who lived there. The Mesolithic mind, so attuned to the cycles of the seasons, was now confronted with a one-way change, a cycle that never returned to its starting point. This brings us to the great, unanswerable human mystery of Doggerland's demise. How did they perceive this? Did they have myths and stories to explain it? Tales of a great water spirit, angry at some transgression, slowly reclaiming the land? Or was their understanding more pragmatic? Did they simply see it as the way of the world, adapting and retreating with a kind of resigned acceptance? We can imagine family groups being forced to abandon ancestral hunting grounds, to move their winter camps to slightly higher ground again and again. What would this have done to their society? As the land area of Doggerland shrank, its population would have been squeezed into an ever smaller territory. Did this lead to conflict? Did groups who had lived peacefully as neighbors for centuries suddenly find themselves competing for the same dwindling resources, their territories overlapping, their seasonal rounds disrupted? Or was the process so slow that society could adapt peacefully, with families simply choosing to move west into the higher, safer ground of what would become mainland Britain? The archaeology of the seabed gives us haunting clues. Trawlers still bring up the bones of land animals and the beautifully worked flint tools of the Doggerland people. And modern seismic surveys have revealed a drowned world of river valleys, coastlines, and even the faint outlines of what might be settlements. A British Atlantis awaiting exploration. For now, it remains a lost world, and we are left to imagine the last generations to call it home. A people living on an ever-shrinking island in the heart of a marsh, watching the inexorable rise of the water, knowing that their children's world would be smaller and wetter than their own. The slow theft of the land by the rising sea had been a story written in centimeters, a narrative of creeping tides and encroaching salt marsh that unfolded over 100 generations. Doggerland, the great heartland, had been dismembered piece by piece, its body slowly consumed until all that remained was a skeleton of its former self. By around 6200 BC, the wide and fertile plain was a distant memory, a story told by elders of a world their grandchildren would never see. What was left was no longer a land bridge in any meaningful sense. It was a treacherous archipelago, a last desperate scattering of low-lying islands, sandbanks, and vast tidal mudflats, dissected by a confusing maze of deep saltwater channels. The great river that had once flowed through the English Channel Valley was now a marine strait, and the North Sea was no longer a distant bay, but a vast and menacing reality. For the few thousand people who still called this remnant landscape home, life would have been a profoundly maritime one, a constant negotiation with the tides, their world shrinking with every passing year. They were living on borrowed time, on a land that was already more sea than soil. And then, one day, the sea came to collect its debt, not with the slow patience it had shown for millennia, but with a sudden, devastating, and unimaginable violence. The event that delivered the final fatal blow to Doggerland did not begin in the salt marshes of the English coast, but hundreds of miles to the northeast, in the cold, dark depths of the Norwegian Sea. Here, on the submerged continental shelf, a geological time bomb had been ticking. For thousands of years, the great rivers of Scandinavia, swollen with glacial meltwater, had dumped billions of tons of sediment onto the sloping edge of the shelf. This created a vast, unstable pile of mud, sand, and gravel, a submarine mountain range of loose debris, hundreds of kilometers long. And then, for reasons geologists still debate, perhaps a subtle shift in ocean currents, or a small earthquake acting as the trigger, the bomb went off. An immense section of the seabed, a slice of the continental shelf the size of Scotland, suddenly gave way. It was the Storegga Slide, one of the largest landslides, on land or underwater, in the recent history of our planet. In a matter of hours, a volume of material more than 300 times the size of Mount Everest slid and slumped into the abyssal deep, a silent, world-changing catastrophe happening in the crushing darkness, miles beneath the waves. A displacement of this magnitude does not happen quietly in the water column above. It heaved the entire ocean upwards, creating a wave. Not a wave in the sense that we know it, not a wind-whipped breaker that curls and crashes on the shore. This was a tsunami, a displacement wave, its energy traveling not on the surface, but through the full depth of the sea. Out in the deep ocean, a passing boat would barely have noticed it, a long, low swell, perhaps only a meter high, its full power disguised beneath a calm surface. But as this pulse of energy reached the shallower waters of the North Sea basin, it began to rear up, like a snake drawing back to strike. It was a wall of water, perhaps 10, maybe even 20 meters high in the narrow coastal inlets, moving at the speed of a galloping horse. It would have arrived without warning. There would have been no storm, no dark clouds on the horizon. The first sign for the people living on the Doggerland archipelago might have been a strange and sudden retreat of the sea, the tide pulling out further and faster than anyone had ever seen, exposing vast, glistening expanses of seabed, stranding fish, and seaweed in a moment of eerie, unnatural calm. And then, on the northern horizon, they would have seen it, a dark line growing impossibly fast, a low churning wall of grey water that was not breaking but simply coming. We must imagine the sheer, animal terror of that moment. There was nowhere to run. The highest point on their low, sandy islands might have been only a few meters above the normal high tide. There were no cliffs to climb, no hills to offer sanctuary. The wave would have hit them not as a single breaker, but as a colossal, unstoppable surge, a turbulent bore of water that simply erased their world. It would have picked up their hide tents, their dugout canoes, their carefully tended hearths, and annihilated them. it would have scoured the islands of their thin soil, uprooted their sacred groves, and deposited a thick layer of marine sand and silt over everything. Any human or animal caught in its path would have been swept away in an instant. This is the mainstream historical fact. The Storegga slide happened, and the tsunami it generated was a real and catastrophic event. The great historiographical mystery is what this really meant for the final separation of Britain. Was this the dramatic, cinematic moment that the land bridge was severed for good? Did the tsunami surge through the remaining low-lying watersheds, scouring out the final channels and turning Britain into an island in a single terrible afternoon? Or was the process more complicated? Some models suggest that while the tsunami was devastating for the coastal populations of Doggerland, a final tenuous land connection, perhaps a high chalk ridge like the one that connects Dover and Calais geologically, might have survived, only to be breached by the more mundane processes of sea level rise and tidal erosion a few centuries later. The debate is between a single apocalyptic end and a final lingering decline. We do not know how many people died that day. It may have been thousands. The entire population of Doggerland wiped out in a prehistoric tragedy on an almost unimaginable scale. Or perhaps the population had already dwindled, the majority having moved to the safer, higher ground of mainland Britain generations before, leaving only a few hardy communities to face the final deluge. Whatever the precise sequence, the effect was the same. The connection was broken. The highway was closed forever. The seesaw of geology and the fury of the ocean had conspired to create a new reality. Britain was now definitively and irrevocably an island. The wave receded. The roar of the tsunami faded into the immense, shocked silence that follows a great catastrophe. The waters that had surged over the last remnants of Doggerland did not retreat to their former boundaries. A new, higher baseline had been established. The world had been remade. For the shell-shocked survivors who had watched this apocalypse from the relative safety of the higher ground in what was now officially Great Britain, the most profound change was not the loss of territory, but the loss of a path. The road east, the path their ancestors had walked for 100 generations, the path that led to the heart of the continent, was gone. In its place was a vast, turbulent, and seemingly infinite expanse of grey water. The sea was no longer just a feature in their landscape, a rich provider on its fringes. It had become the wall at the end of their world. To be Mesolithic and British now meant to be an islander, a new identity forged in the crucible of rising waters and geological violence. This enforced isolation could have been a death sentence. It cut them off from the flow of people, ideas, and resources from the mainland. The genetic pool was now smaller, the possibility of finding partners from distant groups dramatically reduced. A bad year, a disease that swept through a local animal population, could no longer be mitigated by simply moving into a neighboring territory on the continent. The safety net had been cut, but for a people defined by their adaptability, a people who had already adjusted from open tundra to dense forest. This new reality was not an ending, but a new beginning. They did not turn their backs on the sea in fear. They turned to face it, and in its restless energy, they found their future. The loss of Doggerland's terrestrial larder was immense, but the creation of thousands of miles of new coastline with its intricate network of estuaries, bays, rock pools, and cliffs offered a new larder, one of staggering richness for those who had the skill and the courage to unlock it. Life on this new coastline was a life lived to the rhythm of the tides. The sun and the moon, the markers of the day and the seasons, were now joined by a third and more immediate celestial power: the moon's gravitational pull on the water. The daily ebb and flow became the metronome of their existence. Low tide was a time of easy bounty. The whole community, from the youngest children to the oldest elders, would move out onto the newly exposed intertidal zone. This was the great free harvest. They would wade through the rock pools, their eyes sharp for the dark shells of mussels clinging to the rocks and the conical forms of limpets, which had to be knocked free with a sharp, surprising blow. In the muddy estuaries, the women would use their bare feet or simple digging sticks to feel for the hard shells of cockles and oysters buried in the silt. This was not a glamorous hunt, but it was reliable. The shellfish were always there, a predictable and protein-rich food source that could be gathered in huge quantities, a buffer against the failure of a more ambitious hunt. As the tide turned and began its slow creep back towards the shore, the focus would shift. The men would take to the water in their dugout canoes, those vessels that had once been the key to the riverways and were now the key to the sea itself. They would paddle out into the sheltered bays and around the kelp-forested headlands. Their targets were the fish that now swarmed in the coastal waters, the powerful cod and pollock, which could be caught with lines made of twisted sinew, baited and weighted with a notched stone. They would use their barbed antler harpoons to spear the large flatfish that lay camouflaged on the sandy seabed in the clear, shallow water. But the ultimate prizes of the coastal hunt were the sea mammals. The coasts of Mesolithic Britain were home to vast colonies of grey seals and common seals. These animals, clumsy and vulnerable, on the land where they came to rest and breed, were masters of their liquid element. To hunt them was a dangerous and skillful business, requiring immense patience and a deep understanding of their habits. A hunter in his canoe might wait for hours, silent and still as a floating log, for a seal to surface for air, his harpoon ready for a single, swift, and accurate throw. A successful seal hunt was a cause for great celebration. A single animal provided a huge amount of rich, fatty meat, and its blubber could be rendered down into oil for lamps, providing light through the long winter nights. Its tough, waterproof hide was the ultimate material for making clothing, bags, and perhaps even for covering the frames of their hide boats. This total reorientation towards the sea presents us with one of the great questions of the later Mesolithic period. Just how maritime did these people become? The evidence from their bones is clear. Isotopic analysis, which can reveal the chemical signatures of the food a person ate, shows a dramatic shift in their diet. The amount of marine protein they were consuming shot up. They were, without a doubt, eating a huge amount of fish and seafood. But does this mean they were simply coastal dwellers, hunter-gatherers, who had cleverly added seafood to their existing menu of deer and boar? Or did some groups go further, becoming true specialists of the sea, a culture as profoundly maritime as any in the world? This is the hypothesis of the Mesolithic sea peoples. It's a tantalizing idea that some of these groups, particularly on the resource-rich western coasts of Scotland, might have spent most of their lives on or near the water, their dugout canoes capable of not just coastal paddling, but of making journeys to the outlying islands. Did they hunt not just seals, but the dolphins and porpoises that played in the offshore currents? Did they have the capability, the sheer audacity, to hunt the great whales? There is no direct evidence for this. No Mesolithic whale harpoons have ever been found. But it's a possibility that haunts the imagination. The idea of our distant ancestors, in their fire-hollowed canoes, paddling out into the Atlantic swell, masters of their new island home. If the new maritime peoples of Mesolithic Britain left us a story, it is not a story written in words, but in their rubbish. It is a tale told in the discarded shells of a billion meals, a library of leftovers, a vast and monumental archive of garbage. To read this story, we must travel north, far from the sinking plains of the southeast, to the wild and wind-scoured islands of the Inner Hebrides, off the west coast of Scotland. Here, on the tiny, jewel-like island of Oronsay, we find one of the most remarkable and revealing landscapes in all of European prehistory. Oronsay is small, only a couple of square miles, and today it is uninhabited. But for a period of about 500 years, starting around 4000 BC, it was a bustling center of Mesolithic life. And the people who lived here did not just survive, they feasted. The evidence for this feasting rises from the island's gentle green slopes in a series of strange, soft-edged hills. At first glance, you might mistake them for natural features of the landscape. But if you look closer, if you were to scuff the turf with the toe of your boot, you would find they are not made of earth and rock at all. They are made of shells. These are the Oronsay shell middens, colossal man-made mounds of discarded seafood, some of them containing millions upon millions of individual shells. They are the accumulated kitchen waste of a people who lived and ate here for 20 consecutive generations. To stand on one of these middens is to stand on a monument to appetite, a testament to a way of life utterly and completely oriented towards the sea. The sheer scale is difficult to comprehend. These are not small piles. The largest midden is over 25 meters in diameter and several meters thick. They are the Mesolithic equivalent of a city landfill built slowly, meal by meal, tide by tide, over half a millennium. When archaeologists began to excavate these mounds, they found a menu preserved in astonishing detail. The overwhelming majority of the shells, the great bulk of the middens, are from two humble species, the common limpet and the periwinkle. These were the daily bread of the Oronsay people. We can imagine them at low tide, moving across the slippery, seaweed-covered rocks, armed with simple stone limpet hammers, knocking the stubborn mollusks from their stony perches. But mixed in with this mountain of limpets were other, more exciting finds. The bones of fish, particularly saithe, a member of the cod family, were incredibly common. These were not small fish. Analysis of their vertebrae showed they were large, mature individuals, likely caught on lines from dugout canoes in the deep, fast-moving tidal currents between the islands. They also found the bones of seals, the great prize of the coastal hunt, and the remains of numerous seabirds. This was not a starvation diet. This was a rich and varied cuisine, a community that had so mastered its marine environment that it could pick and choose from the ocean's bounty. The true genius of the Oronsay middens, however, is what they can tell us about time. They are not just a menu, they are a calendar. Archaeologists have used two incredibly clever scientific techniques to read this calendar. The first is to look at the otoliths, the tiny calcium carbonate earstones of the seath. Like the rings of a tree, otoliths lay down daily growth rings, and the width of these rings varies with the seasons. By examining the final ring on an otolith from the midden, scientists can determine with incredible precision the season, sometimes even the month, in which that specific fish was caught and eaten. The second technique involves analyzing the chemistry of the periwinkle shells themselves by measuring the ratio of different oxygen isotopes in the shell's growth bands. They can reconstruct the temperature of the seawater in which it grew, again allowing them to pinpoint the season of its harvest. What this detailed analysis revealed was a pattern. It seemed that different middens were used at different times of the year. Some sites were predominantly used in the winter, others in the summer. This led to the classic and beautifully elegant interpretation of life on Oronsay, that a single small band of people moved between the island and its neighbors in a predictable seasonal round. They would spend the winter on one island, perhaps in a sheltered spot, harvesting limpets and hunting the grey seals that bobbed on the shore. Then, in the summer, they would paddle their canoes to another island, a place better suited for line fishing for the great shoals of scythe that migrated through the area. But this neat and tidy picture of one happy family following their seafood calendar around the islands has in recent years been thrown into doubt, creating a fascinating new mystery. Some archaeologists now question whether the seasonal signals are quite so clear. They suggest the sites may have been occupied for longer periods, or even year-round. They propose a different social model. Perhaps Oronsay wasn't the exclusive territory of one small, isolated family. Perhaps it was a central place, a communal territory used by many different groups who lived on the surrounding larger islands. In this view, the great shell middens are not the product of mundane daily meals. They are the spectacular remains of great seasonal feasts. We can imagine a time in the summer when multiple families would gather on Oronsay, a prehistoric festival of the sea. They would come together to arrange marriages, to exchange news and stories, and to reaffirm their social bonds. And they would feast for days on end on a truly epic scale, catching thousands of fish and gathering tens of thousands of shellfish, their discarded shells forming these great, enduring monuments. Are the middens of Oronsay the quiet, domestic garbage of a single family? Or are they the loud, celebratory debris of a whole society coming together? The shells remain silent on the matter, leaving us to wonder at the human stories buried beneath their pearlescent hills. Our story so far has largely been an English one. Its center of gravity, located in the drowned plains of Doggerland, the lakeside camp at Starkar, and the sinking coastlines of the south and east. But to tell the story of Mesolithic Britain is not to tell a single monolithic tale. It is to listen to a chorus of different voices, to hear the regional accents and the local dialects of a culture that was spread across 1,000 miles of wildly varying landscapes. As the wildwood thickened and the rising seas created new barriers and new opportunities, the common Mesolithic toolkit and way of life began to diverge, adapting to local conditions, creating distinct cultural flavors in the north and the west. To understand this richer, more complex picture, we must now turn our ears to the whispers from the west, to the unique stories being written in the mountains of Wales, the islands of Scotland, and most mysteriously of all, across the sea in Ireland. Ireland's story begins with an act of incredible audacity. While Britain was, for a time, an easy place to walk to, Ireland has been an island for much longer. Even at the height of the last ice age, with sea levels at their lowest, a deep and treacherous channel of cold water separated it from the rest of Europe. There was no Irish land bridge. This means that the first people to set foot in Ireland, sometime around 8000 BC, did not get there by accident. They were not simply following a herd of deer that had wandered west. They had to have looked out from the coast of either Britain or mainland Europe, seen what looked like a distant smudge on the horizon, or perhaps saw nothing at all, and were simply guided by the flight of migratory birds and made a conscious, deliberate, and terrifyingly dangerous decision to get in a boat and paddle out into the open sea. This was not a river crossing. This was a blue water voyage, a genuine maritime expedition into the unknown. Who were these first Irish pioneers? This is a profound mystery. Did they come from Britain, island hopping across the narrow North Channel from Scotland? Or did they make a much longer journey directly from the coasts of France or Spain, as some more romantic, though less supported, theories have suggested? Whoever they were, they found a land that was subtly different from its larger neighbor. Ireland was an island of forests and rivers, but it was a gentler, less intimidating landscape. Crucially, it was an impoverished ecosystem. Many of the large animals that roamed Britain's wildwood, like the aurochs and the elk, had never made it across the sea. The largest land mammal the first settlers would have encountered was the wild pig. This had a huge impact on their way of life. They could not be big game hunters in the same way as their British cousins. Instead, they became masters of the river and the forest floor. At a site called Mount Sandal in County Derry, archaeologists found the remains of a settlement that rivals Starkar in its importance. Here, on a high bluff overlooking the River Bann, a community built sturdy, circular huts, their foundations marked by post holes, very similar in style to the house at Howick. And here they lived, not just for a season, but year-round. Their rubbish tells a story of a diet based on the incredible bounty of the river salmon, trout, and eels, supplemented by the wild pigs, birds, and hazelnuts from the surrounding forest. They were a people of the river, their lives tuned to its seasonal pulses, and they developed their own distinctly Irish style of tool. Instead of the tiny geometric microliths common in Britain, they favored a larger, beautifully worked, leaf-shaped flint tool known as a ban flake. It was their Swiss Army knife, an all-purpose tool for butchering fish, working wood, and processing plants. The Mesolithic of Ireland is a quiet and self-contained story, a testament to a small, resourceful population who, having made one great leap of faith across the sea, created a stable and successful world for themselves that would last for 4,000 years. If Ireland's story is one of audacious arrival and quiet adaptation, Scotland's is a tale of life lived on the edge, a masterclass in coastal survival. As we have seen on the island of Aronsay, the people of the Scottish Mesolithic became some of the most specialized maritime hunters in the world. But their world extended far beyond that one small island. From the Clyde estuary to the remote Orkney Islands, they left a trail of shell middens and coastal camps. Theirs was a world defined by the tide, the cliff, and the open water. In a cave at Oban, archaeologists found the remains of a family group buried with grave goods that included harpoons and necklaces of shells, a people whose identity was bound to the sea even in death. Further north, the challenges were even greater. The Scottish Highlands, with their thin soils and harsh climate, supported a far less dense forest and fewer large animals. Survival here meant a total reliance on the coast. At sites like Sand, on the west coast of Skye, we find evidence of communities living in pit houses, harvesting a staggering array of marine resources from seals and otters to over 30 species of fish. This intense focus on the sea raises a thrilling question. Just how far did their maritime world extend? Did they have the seafaring technology, the navigational skills, and the sheer courage to colonize the far-flung northern isles of Orkney and Shetland? Finding definitive Mesolithic sites in these remote archipelagos is incredibly difficult, but tantalizing hints have emerged. The possibility that these early mariners were making regular open ocean voyages to these distant islands thousands of years before the Vikings would completely rewrite our understanding of their capabilities. They were not just coastal foragers. They may have been Europe's first true deep-sea explorers. And what of Wales? Its story is perhaps the most subtle, a whisper caught between the relative riches of England and the dramatic maritime tales of Ireland and Scotland. For a long time, the Welsh Mesolithic was seen as a poor relation, a sparsely populated backwater. But recent discoveries are revealing a unique and vibrant culture. On the Pembrokeshire coast, at a site called the Nab Head, a community lived overlooking the Irish Sea. They left behind not only the typical microlithic tools for hunting, but also thousands of beautifully made shale beads, evidence of a sophisticated craft industry, creating personal adornments that were perhaps traded far and wide. The Welsh mountains, the spine of the country, were not an empty wilderness. Hunters would make long seasonal journeys into the uplands, leaving scatters of flint tools around the high mountain lakes, testament to a deep knowledge of this challenging vertical landscape. Wales was a bridge, a place that looked both east towards the forested heartlands of Britain and west across the sea to Ireland. Its people were connected to both worlds, their culture a unique blend of influences, a quiet but resilient voice in the great chorus of the Mesolithic West. From the windswept coasts and the remote Western Isles, with their great monuments of shell and their whispers of epic sea voyages, let us now pull our focus inwards. Let us travel away from the stories of entire communities and seek out the story of a single person. For it is in the life, and more importantly, the death of one individual, that the vast impersonal narrative of the Mesolithic can suddenly become breathtakingly intimate. Our journey takes us to the Mendip Hills in Somerset, to a place of dramatic limestone cliffs and deep, echoing caverns. We are going to a place called Cheddar Gorge, and we are going there to meet a man who died more than 9,000 years ago. A man who, until very recently, was a complete and utter mystery. Our destination is a specific cavern, Gough's Cave. It is a place that breathes deep time. For millennia, its entrance has been a dark, inviting mouth in the side of the cliff. The air that drifts from it cool and damp, carrying the mineral scent of wet limestone and the deep, silent stillness of the earth. It is a place with a dark and ancient history. 15,000 years ago, long before our Mesolithic story truly began, this cave was a charnel house, a place where the Paleolithic hunters of the Creswellian culture practiced a grim, ritualized form of cannibalism, leaving behind the butchered and gnawed bones of their fellow humans. The cave, it seems, has always been a place of profound and sometimes terrible significance. And it was here in 1903 that workmen digging a drainage ditch near the cave entrance found something remarkable. Curled up on his side in a small recess in the rock lay the almost complete skeleton of a man. He was named, with a certain lack of imagination, Cheddar Man. And for over a century, that is almost all he was: a name, a collection of bones, and a date. Radiocarbon dating placed him at the heart of the Mesolithic, around 7th 150 BC. He was, and remains, Britain's oldest near-complete human skeleton. He became a silent celebrity, the archetypal ancient Briton. Reconstructions were made of his face, artists and sculptors speculating on his features. They almost always depicted him in the same way, with pale skin, light brown hair, and the rugged but recognizably European features of a modern inhabitant of Somerset. He was a blank slate, a prehistoric everyman onto whom we projected our own image, assuming a simple, linear ancestry that stretched from him to us. He lay in his museum case, a fascinating but ultimately mute witness, his deepest secrets locked away in the very fabric of his being. And there he waited, for 100 years, for science to invent a key. That key was the science of ancient DNA. In 2018, a team of scientists from the Natural History Museum and University College London embarked on a project that sounded like science fiction. They were going to sequence Cheddar Man's entire genome. The challenge was immense. DNA is a fragile molecule, and after 9,000 years in a damp cave, most of it had degraded to nothing. But they had a secret weapon. They knew that the densest, best protected bone in the entire human body is the petrous bone, a tiny, pyramid-shaped part of the temporal bone that houses the inner ear. It is a biological vault. With painstaking care, they drilled a tiny hole, no wider than a pencil lead, into Cheddar Man's petrous bone and extracted a few milligrams of bone powder. From this dust, using revolutionary new sequencing techniques, they managed to piece together the shattered fragments of his genetic code. It was the ultimate cold case, and the forensics team had just opened a genetic time machine. What they found sent shockwaves through our understanding of British history. The first revelation was his eyes. The genes were unequivocal. Cheddar Man had blue eyes. The second was his hair, dark brown or black, with a texture that was wavy or curly. But it was the third revelation that changed everything. The genes that control skin pigmentation told a story that no one had predicted. Cheddar Man's skin was not pale. It was not fair. It was dark. Ranging, the scientists said, from dark brown to almost black. Let that sink in for a moment. The oldest known Briton, the man we had held up for a century as our founding father, looked more like the inhabitants of sub-Saharan Africa than a modern Englishman. This one discovery, pulled from a pinch of bone dust, completely and utterly demolished our lazy, linear assumptions about what ancient Europeans looked like. It proved that whiteness, as a widespread trait in the population of Britain, was a recent arrival, coming much, much later with the first farmers. His genes told other stories too. They confirmed he was lactose intolerant, unable to digest milk, as an adulter trait shared by all Mesolithic people. And they connected him to the wider world. His genetic profile was that of the Western hunter-gatherer group. the same people who had first crossed Doggerland. His closest relatives were not modern Britons, but other Mesolithic skeletons found in Spain, Hungary, and Luxembourg. He was a true European of his time. And this brings us to the lingering mystery of the man himself. His genes tell us who he was, but his bones remain quiet about how he died. He was young, only in his early 20s. He was healthy, with strong teeth and no signs of major disease. There is a lesion on his skull, just above his left eye, but it's unclear if this was a fatal wound or an old, healed injury. Did he die violently in a conflict with another human? Was he killed by an animal? Or did he simply succumb to an infection, a prehistoric flu, and crawl into the quiet, cool darkness of the cave to die? We don't know if he was deliberately buried by his family, or if he died alone and was simply covered by the accumulating sediments of the cave floor. Cheddar Man has given us his face, a face that is both startlingly different and deeply, recognizably human. But the final chapter of his personal story, the story of his last days, remains his own. The stark, scientific portrait of Cheddar Man, with his dark skin, dark, curly hair, and piercing blue eyes, gives us a face to put to this ancient world. It allows us, for a moment, to look across the gulf of 9,000 years and see a person, not a specimen. But the portrait, as revolutionary as it is incomplete. It is the image of a man stripped bare. It tells us nothing of how he presented himself to the world, nothing of the choices he made to adorn his body, to signal his identity, his status, or his membership in a particular group. To find these missing pieces of the picture, we must search for the faintest, most personal of traces. The art they wore, the beautiful, non-essential things they created not just to survive, but to live with a sense of style and meaning. For a long time, the British Mesolithic was considered an age without art, a purely functional, pragmatic period. The people were seen as too busy surviving to have time for the frivolities of decoration. But this grim, colorless view has been slowly and surely proven wrong by a series of small, exquisite discoveries. Mesolithic people, it turns out, had a keen eye for beauty and a desire for self-expression. They had jewelry. It was not jewelry of gold or silver, but it was no less precious for that, for its value was measured in the time, skill, and deep knowledge of the natural world required to create it. One of the most common forms of adornment was the simple, humble bead. At sites like the Nab Head in Wales, archaeologists have found thousands of them. Tiny, disc-shaped beads, painstakingly crafted from the soft, grey-black stone we call shale. To make one of these beads, a person would first have to find the right kind of stone, then shape it into a small disc, and finally, undertake the most difficult task of all, drilling a tiny hole through its center so it could be strung. They did this with a delicate flint drill bit called a borer, a slow, patient process of twisting and applying pressure, where a moment's carelessness could shatter hours of work. To find thousands of these beads suggests a genuine industry, a community investing a significant amount of its time in creating these small objects of beauty. We can imagine them strung together on a thread of sinew, forming a necklace or a bracelet, a dark, gleaming line against the deep brown of their skin. Animal teeth were another popular choice. The canine teeth of foxes, the incisors of deer, the teeth of wild boreal were perforated at the root and strung together. These were not just decorations. They were trophies, powerful symbols of a hunter's skill and courage. To wear a necklace of bear teeth was to carry the very essence of that formidable animal with you, a statement of your own power and your relationship with the spirit of the hunt. But the most beautiful and mysterious materials they used came from even further afield. At Starkar, buried in the same peat that preserved the antler frontlets, a single, perfect pendant was found. It was made of amber, that strange, fossilized resin, the golden tears of ancient pine trees, which washes up on the shores of the Baltic Sea, hundreds of miles away. How did this one piece of amber travel all the way to a lakeside camp in Yorkshire? It is a testament to the vast, slow-moving trade and exchange networks that crisscrossed Mesolithic Europe. A single, beautiful object passed from hand to hand, its story growing with every transaction, until it finally came to rest in the damp earth of a distant island. It is a drop of frozen sunshine, a tangible link to a world far beyond their immediate horizon. But if personal adornment gives us a glimpse into their sense of style, the art they engraved onto their tools offers a window into their minds. And it is here that we encounter a deep and fascinating mystery. The art of Mesolithic Britain is almost entirely abstract. While their contemporaries in Scandinavia were carving lifelike images of elk and whales onto rock faces and bone tools, the British artists seemed uninterested in depicting the world around them. Instead, they decorated their antler harpoons and bone tools with intricate geometric patterns, chevrons, zigzags, hatched triangles, and complex latticework designs. These are not random doodles. They are carefully executed, deliberate patterns. Engraved with a sharp flint point, the lines precise and confident. At a site in Romsey, Hampshire, a piece of worked bone was found covered in a dense pattern of interlocking lines, a design of subtle complexity. A bone tool from a cave in Derbyshire is decorated with a series of finely cut parallel lines and cross-hatching. What are we to make of this? This is the great open question of Mesolithic art. Were these patterns purely decorative, the pleasing rhythmic work of a human mind that finds beauty in order and symmetry? Were they a form of tribal marking, a way for different groups to identify their tools, like a family crest or a modern brand logo? Or was there a deeper meaning encoded in these abstract designs? This is the most tantalizing possibility. Some researchers have suggested that these patterns are not patterns at all, but a form of symbolic communication, a kind of proto-writing. Could the zigzag lines on a harpoon be a map of a river system, a guide to the best fishing spots? Could a series of notches and lines be a lunar calendar, a way of tracking the months and the seasons, essential knowledge for a people whose lives were so closely tied to the cycles of nature? Could the complex lattice work represent the weave of a fish trap, a form of sympathetic magic intended to ensure a good catch? We have no Rosetta Stone to decipher these enigmatic symbols. The code, if there ever was one, is lost forever. But it forces us to consider the possibility that these people, who we so often imagine as silent, pre-literate hunters, may have had a sophisticated system for recording and transmitting complex information. Their art, so quiet and unassuming, might just be a language that we have forgotten how to read. For 4,000 years, the sea had been the wall at the end of the world. Since the final flooding of Doggerland, the people of Britain had lived in a state of splendid self-contained isolation. They were islanders to their very core. Their world was the deep green of the wildwood and the endless shimmering grey of the Atlantic. Their stories were of the deer and the salmon, of the spirits of the river and the power of the tide. They had perfected a way of life, a delicate and successful dance with their environment that had sustained them for 150 generations. Their world, as far as they knew, was the whole world, its rhythms ancient, its future a predictable continuation of its past. And then one day, on a beach somewhere on the southern coast, a strange boat landed. A new story had begun, and it was a story in which they, the original people of this land, would not be the heroes. The newcomers did not arrive as an invading army. There was no fleet of warships, no clash of arms on the shingle. The arrival was likely a quiet, tentative affair. A few small boats, perhaps not the heavy dugouts of the locals, but lighter craft made of animal hides stretched over a wooden frame, landing in a sheltered cove. The people who stepped out of them would have looked and sounded utterly alien. They may have worn clothes not of leather and fur, but of a strange, woven material called wool. They spoke a language that shared no roots with the tongues of the native islanders. But the strangest thing of all was their luggage. They brought with them a collection of things so bizarre, so profoundly unnatural, that the local Mesolithic people who may have watched them from the cover of the woods would have struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. They brought with them pens made of wicker, and inside these pens were animals. Not wild animals, captured for a feast, but strange, placid creatures, smaller, tamer versions of the mighty aurochs, and a completely new animal, a white, fluffy, docile beast that we would call a sheep. And they carried with them leather bags filled not with nuts or dried meat, but with tiny, hard, inedible-looking seeds. These were the first Neolithic farmers. They were not just new people. They were the bearers of a revolutionary and world-altering idea. It was an idea born thousands of miles away and thousands of years earlier in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East. An idea that had been slowly spreading across Europe for generations, transforming every culture it touched. And the idea was this: you did not have to find your food. You could make it. You did not have to follow the herds. You could own them. You did not have to gather the bounty of the forest. You could clear the forest and command the bounty to grow from the earth at your feet. For a Mesolithic mind, this would have been little short of magic, and a deeply sacrilegious magic at that. The forest was not an obstacle to be cleared. It was a sacred, living entity, the home of the spirits and the provider of all things. To cut it down and burn it, to scar the earth with a digging stick and plant foreign seeds in its wound, would have been an act of profound disrespect, an invitation for disaster. The farmers brought with them not just a new idea, but a whole new toolkit for its implementation. They carried polished stone axes made of hard volcanic rock, ground smooth and sharp, far more effective at felling trees than the flaked flint axes of the Mesolithic. And they brought pottery. For the first time, people could create containers that were both waterproof and fireproof. This simple, miraculous technology transformed cooking, allowing for the slow simmering of stews and gruels, and it revolutionized storage, protecting their precious grain from damp and pests. Their entire way of life was a stark contrast to the mobile, reactive world of the hunter-gatherer. Theirs was a life of planning, of labor, of patience, and of a relentless focus on the future. They were tied to their fields, their lives governed not by the immediate movements of the deer, but by the long, slow, anxious wait from sowing to harvest. This, then, is the great and tragic mystery of the end of the Mesolithic. What happened when these two worlds collided? When the forager, whose worldview was based on taking what the generous living world offered, met the farmer, whose worldview was based on taming and commanding a reluctant, inanimate earth. For a long time, the favored model was one of peaceful assimilation. In this gentle version of history, the local Mesolithic people saw the advantages of this new, reliable food source and gradually, happily, adopted the farming way of life, intermarrying with the newcomers and creating a new, blended culture. It's a comforting story. But the cold, hard science of genetics has recently told a different and much starker tale. Analysis of ancient DNA, comparing the skeletons of late Mesolithic hunter-gatherers like Cheddar Man with those of the first Neolithic farmers, has revealed a shocking discontinuity. The two groups did not mix. The farmers, who traced their ancestry back to Anatolia in modern-day Turkey, almost completely replaced the indigenous population. Within a few centuries of their arrival, the ancient genetic signature of the Western hunter-gatherers, a lineage that had occupied Britain for 6,000 years, simply vanishes. This was a population replacement on a massive scale. Does this mean it was a violent conquest, a prehistoric genocide, where the newcomers, with their larger numbers and different technologies, simply wiped out the locals? There is very little archaeological evidence for widespread warfare. There are no great battle sites, no mass graves. The truth may be more subtle, and perhaps more chilling. It may have been a conquest by demography. The farmers, with their more reliable and calorie-rich food supply, were able to support a much larger population and have more children. They simply outbred the hunter-gatherers. The native people were not necessarily killed. They were squeezed out, pushed to the margins of the land, to the mountains of the north and west, where farming was difficult, their numbers dwindling with every generation until they were gone, a ghost lineage on their own land. We are left to imagine those first fateful encounters on the beach, a meeting of two futures, a moment of curiosity that would, for one of them, lead to utter oblivion. The end did not come with a bang. It came with the sound of an axe, not the familiar percussive thwack of flaked flint on wood, but a new, deeper, more resonant thump. It was the sound of a polished stone axe, wielded by a stranger, biting deep into the heart of an ancient oak, a tree that had stood as a silent witness for 500 years. For the last Mesolithic people, this was the sound of their world beginning to unravel. The replacement was not a single violent event. It was a slow, creeping, and inexorable fading, a process that played out over centuries, a quiet tragedy written in the changing scent of the air, the shrinking of the forest, and the slow silencing of an ancient way of life. Imagine a hunter, a man in his prime, a descendant of Cheddar Man's people, following the tracks of a red deer along the edge of a river valley. This is a path his ancestors have walked for 1,000 years. But today, something is different. He comes to a clearing that was not there last season. It is a raw, ugly wound in the side of the forest, the earth black with ash, the great stumps of the oaks still smoking. In the center of this clearing is a strange angular structure of wood and mud, and around it, a fence made of woven branches, a concept so alien it might as well be from the moon. Inside the fence are those placid, foolish-looking animals, the sheep, bleating in the sun. The hunter stands in the shadows of the remaining trees, a ghost in his own land, watching a new world being born, a world that has no place for him. His deer track, his ancestral right-of-way, now leads directly into a wall. The map of the world, which he holds so perfectly in his memory, is being actively, deliberately, and irrevocably erased. This was the primary engine of the Mesolithic decline, a fundamental, irreconcilable conflict over the very nature of the land itself. For the hunter-gatherer, the wildwood was everything. It was the larder, the hardware store, the pharmacy, and the cathedral. Its dense, chaotic, and ancient ecosystem was the entire basis of their existence. For the farmer, that same forest was an obstacle. It was a wilderness to be tamed, a darkness to be cleared, a resource to be consumed to make way for the true providers, the fields of wheat and barley. Every acre of forest that fell to the farmer's polished axe was an acre of hunting territory lost to the forager forever. The hazel groves that provided their winter staple were burned to make way for pasture. The wetlands where they hunted waterfowl were drained for agriculture. The deer, the boar, and the aurochs, their great wild companions in the landscape, were either driven away by the loss of their habitat or killed because they competed with the farmer's precious livestock. It was an ecological conquest. The farmers were not just occupying the land, they were terraforming it, transforming it into an environment in which the Mesolithic way of life was simply no longer possible. Alongside this slow-motion environmental catastrophe, there was likely a second invisible killer. The farmers, with their denser communities and their close, daily contact with domesticated animals, would have been the carriers of a host of pathogens, bacteria, and viruses for which the native hunter-gatherer population had no inherited immunity. Diseases that might have been a mere childhood sickness for the farmers, like influenza or a form of pox, could have swept through the Mesolithic bands like a firestorm. This is a story we have seen played out again and again in human history, when two long-separated populations meet. The hunter-gatherers, living in small, mobile, and scattered groups, were healthy, but they were immunologically naive. A single farmer visiting a Mesolithic camp to trade could have unknowingly initiated an epidemic that would wipe out an entire lineage. This grim biological reality would have amplified the demographic pressure, a silent cull that weakened the native population from within, making their recovery and resistance even more difficult. What of the human interaction in all of this? Did they fight? The archaeological record remains stubbornly quiet on this. There is no evidence of a great war, of fortified settlements being burned, of massacres. While there were undoubtedly moments of localized violence, the overall picture seems to be one of avoidance. The hunter-gatherers, faced with this relentless, encroaching tide, appear to have done what they had always done when faced with pressure. They moved. They retreated. They fell back to the places the farmers did not want, the lands that were too steep, too rocky, too wet, or too cold for their new agriculture. They became a people of the margins. We see their final, lingering presence in the uplands of Wales and Scotland, on the rocky western coasts, and on the islands of the Hebrides. In these places, the Mesolithic way of life with its reliance on the sea and the wild resources of the hills, could persist for a few more centuries, a flickering candle against the rising dawn of a new age. But it was a culture living on borrowed time. Their world was shrinking, their connections to other groups were severed, and their ancient traditions were slowly losing their meaning in a world that had been fundamentally changed. It was a slow fading away, a long, quiet goodbye, whispered from the last wild corners of the island. The fire at the heart of the farmhouse grows bright. The polished axe is hung by the door. The sound of the forest, once a symphony of wildness, is now a deep and distant silence, punctuated only by the bleating of sheep. The long age of the hunter has passed into the keeping of the soil, its people and its practices absorbed by the earth, their genetic line all but extinguished. And so it would seem, our story ends. A 4,000-year epic of survival and ingenuity, of art and spirit, is erased in a few short centuries by a new idea and a new way of being. The first people of Britain, the true natives of this island, simply vanished, leaving behind only a litter of chipped flints and the bones of their last representatives, like Cheddar Man, to be discovered by a future they could never have imagined. And yet, is it ever that simple? Does a world truly vanish without a trace? Or does it leave echoes, whispers, ghosts in the machine of the land itself? The most obvious place to search for a legacy is in the blood, in the DNA that connects the present to the past. But as we have seen, the genetic echo of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in the modern British population is astonishingly faint, almost silent. The replacement by the Neolithic farmers was so near total that it seems a door was slammed shut on that ancient lineage. But almost is a powerful word. In the far reaches of the West, in the DNA of people with deep ancestry in the Scottish Islands or the mountains of Wales, some studies have found a slightly higher, though still tiny, percentage of that original hunter-gatherer signature. It is a mere whisper in the roar of subsequent migrations, but it is there, a ghost in the blood, a hint that on the farthest margins, in the places where farming was hardest, some of the old people did not vanish, but were, perhaps, slowly and quietly absorbed. But perhaps the truest legacy is not written in our genes, but in the very ground beneath our feet. We look at the British landscape, and we imagine we see two things: the neat, ordered world of our modern farms and cities, and the wild, untamed nature of the moors, the mountains, and the ancient woodlands. But what if that wildness is in part an illusion? What if some of those landscapes we cherish for their natural beauty are in fact cultural artifacts, their shapes and ecologies a direct inheritance from our Mesolithic ancestors? Remember the theory of forest management, of using controlled fire to create clearings, to encourage the growth of hazel, and to attract game. It is entirely possible that some of Britain's open heathlands and moorlands, which we think of as naturally treeless, were first created and then maintained for centuries by Mesolithic fire setters. The ancient gnarled oaks of a place like Sherwood Forest might owe their existence not to a lack of human interference, but to a very specific kind of interference. A woodland managed for hunting for so long that its very structure was changed. The echo here is not a sound, it is a silence. It is the absence of the dense, dark wildwood that would otherwise have been there. We may be walking, unknowingly, through a 9,000-year-old garden. And what of the mind? What of the stories? Is it possible that the myths of a land can hold a memory far longer than its bloodlines? This is the most speculative, and perhaps the most romantic, of all the echoes we can search for. As the farming cultures advanced, with their new languages and new gods, what did they make of the shy, dark-skinned, elusive people of the woods they were displacing? Could the rich folklore of Britain and Ireland, with its tales of the little people, the fairies, the seed, who live in hollow hills and ancient mounds, and who resent the intrusion of iron and the ringing of church bells, be a kind of distorted folk memory, a memory of a real encounter between a taller, metal-using, agricultural people and a smaller, stone-using, hunter-gatherer people who were retreating into the last wild places? It is a hypothesis that can never be proven, a ghost story in its own right. But it is a powerful thought that the fairy tales we tell our children might just be the final fractured echo of a people who have otherwise been lost to history. So, as our long journey comes to its close, and as you prepare now for sleep, perhaps you can listen for these echoes yourself. The story of Mesolithic Britain is not a tale of a distant alien people. It is the foundational story of the island itself. They were the first to walk this land after the great ice had gone. They gave the first human names to its rivers and its hills, names that are now lost forever, but whose cadence might just survive in the sounds of the places we know today. They were the ones who watched as the sea rose and the island was born. Their world lies buried, but not gone. It is there in the strange gleam of a flint on a country path. It is there in the taste of a hazelnut. It is there in the dark, curly hair and blue eyes of a stranger you pass on the street. And it is there in the deep, quiet wildness of the landscape, a wildness they did not just inhabit, but which they helped to create. Their age is over. Their time is done. But their echoes remain, woven into the very fabric of the land, waiting in the silence for those who are patient enough to listen. Rest now. May your sleep be deep, and your dreams be peaceful.